Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Dualistic Unity. Today is going to be a Q&A episode, and I'm Andrew.
I'm Ray, and we're going to be doing our best to provide some perspective on some of these questions. And I hate to say we're going to give answers because, of course, answers aren't necessarily what we're looking for, but we're definitely going to look at it from as many different angles as we can, kind of give you our perspective on it. And then, of course, hopefully that will encourage you to submit more questions for next season's Q&A episode so we can go into greater depth or even cover it in a future episode in season 2. So we're going to start here. The first question comes from one of our supporters on Patreon. And of course, I'm excited to ask this question because it was part of our foundational discussion when we first started this podcast. I'm curious to know about you and Andrew's thoughts on bad trips on mushrooms or other psychedelics. Could you describe how you would deal with that and what a bad trip would feel like? So I'd like to let Andrew go first on this
one. So in my understanding and things that I've read, I haven't personally had a bad trip. And I don't even like using the word bad because they're all just individual perceptions of how things are. But I think when people describe having bad trips, it's very much a resistance versus acceptance type situation, or, resisting versus surrendering to what you're feeling and accepting what you're feeling, or like going down this path of not wanting to feel what you feel. So in my situation, I've, only tripped on higher doses of mushrooms a handful of times, but the first few times, especially the first and second time I did a higher dose, there was a point I remember on the come up where I started to it started hitting me pretty strongly. And there was a split second where I was like, oh boy, this is kind of a lot right now. And then I immediately told myself, this is okay. It's okay. I'm supposed to be feeling this. It's okay. Surrender, accept. And those sorts of things just kept going through my head. So I think in a situation where I may have continued on that, like, whoa, I don't like this. I changed my mind. I don't want to go down this path. Like that can lead to a situation where you are resistant to it and potentially what someone would label as a bad trip. But I think the thing that through the act of tripping or taking mushrooms or anything like that, you are able to see things more clearly, but also the act in itself is sort of not like a meditation, but a practice in acceptance, because the experience of it in itself, like you feel differently. You are existing in a slightly altered state of being than you typically are. It's different. It's uncertain. It's unknown. So in itself, it's a practice in this acceptance of uncertainty. So I don't know, good, bad, all just perceptions, right? But that is my take in my experience, where I think there were points where if I had resisted as opposed to surrendered or accepted, it would have potentially gone down a route that could have been considered a bad trip. But that's my take.
That's good. It is, in fact, I used to refer to it as a symbolic leap of faith. Right? Like you're surrendering control, you're surrendering it up to this substance that you're taking, and you're just waiting to see what's going to happen. And so your mind is always wanting to do the same thing that it's always doing. I've always found that on psychedelics or hallucinogenics, regardless of what they might be, what happens is the state of mind that we're always in, or rather the mentality that we're always experiencing, all of a sudden just becomes more pronounced. It's all of a sudden like our sensitivity to our own mind becomes increased. So anything that comes through our mind is so raw and in our face that we don't have our identity, and we don't have the task list of tomorrow, and we don't have our ambitions and our worries about what people think of us to block us from having those thoughts, to have that experience, right? So I know in my experience when I was much, much younger, I've been in a number of situations where the situation went bad. And had I not been able to relax myself through it, it would have been a very different experience for me. Experiences where I've been, say, at somebody else's house, and then all of a sudden something in a different part of the house went bad, and suddenly there were police there, and there was a fight that broke out and all of this. And meanwhile, I was in the basement just blissing out on life, having a great conversation about the philosophy of God and being. And then suddenly we come upstairs and there's cops outside and there's all kinds of stuff happening. And we're like, what is happening here? And of course, at that point, you can panic. And one of our friends did. And so we just kind of walked him through the same lessons that we walk ourselves through all the time, every day, which is you don't know why they're here. You don't know that they're here for you. You don't know what's happening. So don't assume anything, right? And so all of a sudden, after about 5-10 minutes of doing that with him and just walking, removing ourselves from the narrative and all our assumptions of what it might be, he was doing just fine. And so it's very much the same thing that we do in our waking life, except that it's so much more important that we take it as a priority on hallucinogenics or in psychedelics or in altered states of consciousness because of that sensitivity, because of that particular, just how much of a hair trigger your mind can be in that state. Because if you decide, I don't like this, you're going to get about 1,000 reasons that you don't like this. And they're all going to come at once. Where if you go, I don't know what's happening, you're going to come up with 1,000 reasons to not care. Right. And it's that simple. And it's because your brain is working so much faster in those states of mind. It's not resorting to the same structure it's used to. It's relying on all of your senses, not just the ones that you're focusing on. There's so much happening. So often a bad trip is the trip that we don't allow to happen on its own. It's kind of the point. It's the same thing we do in life. We don't allow life to happen on its own. We're constantly micromanaging our role within it. We're constantly micromanaging and analyzing everything that we do from moment to moment to moment to moment. And so we don't allow the here and now to be what it is. We're always superimposing distortion over top of it. So just as we do that in our waking life, we do that on hallucinogenics, except on hallucinogenics, it just happens that much faster. So it becomes the practice, like Andrew said, of letting go. It becomes a day-to-day practice. If you practice it in your waking life, then on hallucinogenics, you won't have any problems at all. But if you practice it on a psychedelic experience and not in your waking life, then you're going to assume it's the psychedelics that are giving you those insights when it's not. It was the choice that you were making in the moment, regardless of the conscious environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I've found too with, just recently getting into, mushroom psychedelic realm is that it very much like I fully remember how I felt on them when I was peeled back like that. And it very much has meshed into my sober existence. Like I wake up and walking around like how I felt microdosing 2 months ago, I feel like that not microdosing now. And even I found, which has been kind of interesting, I took what was it, like 1.5 grams like a week and a half ago, and I was fully hallucinating, and I don't think I did that like 2 months ago. Like it's become stronger in the sense that like I get there quicker, because I remember you said that you take 0.5 gram now and you get to a place that you used to get on like 7 or 8 grams. Is that, do you think because you begin incorporating it more into your own life? So there's already, so like an example I just sort of thought of was like, because when you take mushrooms, it kind of peels you back more. So like there's all of these layers, say with someone who is very sure of things, and then, mushrooms peel those back, and they may peel a few back, and then, a higher dose may peel more back. But then if you live in existence where there's fewer layers to begin with, then it peels you back to the point that like there's just one peeling. So like for you, 0.5 gram, that's all you need, and all of a sudden you're fully peeled back. Whereas someone else, it may change. So like for me, taking 1.5 grams could be the equivalent of taking like 2.5 grams 2 months ago. But I found that to be very interesting, because I always tell people like, oh yeah, you start hallucinating around between 2 and 3 grams, totally depends on people. And I took 1.5 grams, and I'm like, wow, I'm very much like tripping right now. I was not really expecting this, but all right, cool.
Saving money. Right. But no, it really is that. It's you described it really well. It's like there are so many layers. There's that gap between who we are in sobriety and then who we are in the psychedelic experience, right? And if it is a very wide gap, if the rest of the time you're always thinking you are something, and then all of a sudden you end up in this place where you're not thinking about anything, it takes you a while to just get used to that state of being. And so you kind of ease yourself into it, which is often why we resist on a trip, it's all of a sudden it becomes a little bit too much to let go of. We're like, oh, I don't like how that feels, right? And we resist, and that's when things kind of go sideways. Which is why we answered somebody else on our live stream last week on Patreon that if you're going to look into doing this as an experience, start very small. Start very small. Allow yourself to kind of peel the layers back gradually. Allow yourself to get used to the idea that you don't always have to be thinking about yourself. So that way, when you get to that place, it's not such a contrast between one and the other. It's not so jarring, because that's very much what it is. But, and I want to make this point again, this is the same thing is true for every single moment. We're always avoiding the intensity of being present, right? It doesn't matter on psychedelics or not, because there's nothing that psychedelics can do to your brain that your brain can't do to itself, right? And so in each and every moment, we have the same opportunity to just let go and allow ourselves to experience, what it is to be high, which is, again, just synonymous with an extreme state of relaxation. That's all that is, right? But yeah, I find it really interesting that it's always the same choice. It's just how quickly our mind reacts to that choice, how quickly our mind is willing to go in the direction that we want it to go. And that's always based on what we do day to day, moment to moment. It's based on our priorities. So as you are more and more abandoning your perspective that you are Andrew, there's just less Andrew to let go of. Right. So all of a sudden there you're like, I'm back to being who I am. Wow, I really got caught up in that fiction for a bit. Right. Whereas before it was like, oh my God, it's all a fiction. And it's this massive, astonishing insight. And then after a while, you're just like, yeah, I remember that. I'm good to go. And it's not this big jarring experience because you've been there. And this is often why meditation can be useful to people if they have a very busy lifestyle, is that it provides you that North Star. It reminds you of what it is you can experience. It reminds you there's other options rather than just the hectic pace that you're on. And that's the whole point of those experiences, is to give yourself some context, right? If you're always running, if you're always thinking you are an identity, the idea that you can live free of that doesn't make any sense until you've experienced it to some degree, which is why I always recommend people go for walks, or people question their narratives or question who they think they are, because at least then they'll have a moment of, oh, that's not real. And then that leads them to want to experience that more. But without the experience, it's all conceptual, which is often questions that I get from people, and we'll get to that next. I've asked my question. It's your turn.
This is from a Instagram Q&A. This is in regards to enlightenment, and I'm not 100% sure, but I'll just read the question. How much enlightenment coaching do you need before you can go on your own? So I think there's a lot to unpack in this question, quite frankly. So how much enlightenment coaching do you need to go on your own? So there's so many parts to this. I think enlightenment in itself, talking about that, enlightenment coaching, whatever that is, and going out on your own to be an enlightenment coach, or to become enlightened on your own without a coach. But we can just talk about it, because I think we could probably spend a whole episode talking about this question. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about this many times, the idea of enlightenment, of being this sort of destination, this future place that, you have to put work in and you have to get coached on to get there. And there's people out there who, they're enlightened, so they can teach you how to be enlightened.
The
and
experts.
At the end of that charged $500 an hour, and but anyway, so to start, the idea of enlightenment is nothing more than a concept that we have created. And I think there's understandings people equate to that, but it's this sort of journey that people think of, that they go through spiritual practices, and eventually they end up one day at enlightenment. Like they're on this rainbow, and it's like it's like the pot of gold. Do I take a right or a left at this street? And it's like enlightenment's that way. And it's like, so at the end of the day, I don't even like using the word enlightenment, but I think it's the understanding understanding that there is nowhere to get, there is no destination to achieve. And as long as you think there is a destination to achieve, you will always miss it, because the idea of having a destination goes directly against the way that people explain, this made up idea of enlightenment to be, understanding that it's here now always. It's just I think if it's anything, it's the understanding that there is nothing outside of here and now. And it's the understanding that there is no place to get to, and there is no enlightenment, and there is no, peak that you need to continue working towards or get coached on in any way, and that it is here and now always. So if you go on this massive journey to get to a point where you find enlightenment, become enlightened, it's you can't even describe it. Even if that were the case, that there was a journey and there was a point, it's a moment also. Like that idea of enlightenment is one moment you're like, oh, my ego is dead and I am enlightened. And then it's like, so 3 seconds ago your ego was dead and you were enlightened, but what about now? It's like, well, now I'm going to hold on to that idea for the rest of my life, and I'm going to say that I had an ego death and that I am enlightened, and I'm going to work to get back to that point for the rest of my life. And it's like, that point is here now. It isn't a point that you reached at one point. It's always now. And that's the simple beauty of it, that again, we've talked about, 10 to 20 times, is that it is always here now. You can never miss it, because it's always where you are. It's what you are at the end of the day. So that's my initial spiel, but
that's really good. I love that. It's funny. I had somebody respond to me recently. I did a video about ego deaths, just saying that it's kind of an inaccurate description, because it implies finality, that all of a sudden your ego is just gone because you've made this one choice to kill it, and then that's it. You're good for the rest of your life. And that's not how it goes, because of course your ego is the perception of division. It's just how much you commit to that perception as truth that causes all of your distortion. So I just thought it was really interesting that basically the person was saying that try DMT and then tell me there's no ego death. And that's the danger of having that one moment where your ego slips aside and then assuming you're good. So my response was, I'm assuming you're not on it when you're writing this comment, because everything you just said was egotistical, right? I achieved it in the past. All of that is ego, right? And then that's the point, is it's not the concept. It's not the final end result. It's not an achievement that you can put up on your wall, right? It's none of that. And I just want to share two stories in response to the question and your answer that I've always felt to be very useful. One is, they're both about students who were fairly smart and intelligent and got the concepts, but were having problems letting go enough to realize the truth. And one student goes to his Zen master and says, I've studied everything. I've read through all of the scrolls. I've read through I've studied under multiple masters. I'm just not getting it. What is the secret to enlightenment? And rather than respond, the master just turns around and on a piece of paper on the wall writes attention. Student says, that's it? That's all you're going to give me? What is that? What does that mean? What does attention mean? Teacher writes, attention, attention. Student doesn't understand. He's like, this isn't saying anything to me. And he writes it again. Attention, attention, attention. He's like, what does that mean? He's like, attention is attention. There's nothing else to say. Pay attention, right? Because in paying attention, you're not thinking about yourself. You're in the moment. It's what's real, right? So on the one hand, how much coaching do you need to achieve enlightenment? None at all, right? Some would say, oh, you need to meet an enlightened master, but they're forgetting that the first enlightened master didn't have a master to work from, right? So if that's possible for them, it's possible for you. It really just comes down to attention. And secondly, priority, which is why I want to touch on this second story, which I'm pretty sure I've told before, but I'm going to say it again because it's important. There was another student, also very talented, went to another master and said the same thing. I don't get it. I'm not understanding this. I study all the time. I talk to other students. I talk to other masters. I'm just not getting it. Show me the secrets to enlightenment. Teach me the final lesson, as it were. So the master says, well, let's go for a walk. And brings him down to the river, and he says, look there, through the water at the bottom of the river. Look at the rocks. Student leans down. It's like, yeah. He's like, no, look closer. He gets down to the water. Master takes his head and pushes it underneath the water, and he holds him there. Dude's just frantically sputtering and trying to get up out of the water. Finally, he lets him up. He breathes for air. The master says, when you want enlightenment as much as you wanted that breath, you'll have it. And that's it. It's attention and priority. How much are you tired of your conflict? How much are you tired of suffering? How much are you tired of the world you know and the things that you think you know and all of the overcommitment that goes with that? That's really all it comes down to. There is nothing else. Everything else is just pageantry. It's just a show. All the enlightened, like the bells and the robes and the incense and all of that, it's all for nothing. It comes from within. It comes from you. If you're tired of experiencing the division that you perpetuate, that's where it starts, because then it comes from you. It's attention, right? And it's priority. Everything else just peels away over time. Just keep going. But yeah, and if you can find people to talk about, it will help. But be careful who you lean on for answers, because the answers that they give you are theirs. They won't work the same for you.
Yeah, certainly. I like the part about priorities. That's interesting, because I think it was the last podcast episode I made back in July, before I had that realization that I'm not Andrew. And I called it, it was something that was sort of, helping me cope with stuff, was figuring out your ultimate priority, like your priority above all else. And I talked for mine, it was being present and reducing stress. So it was like, and the way I explained it, and it seemed to resonate with a lot of people, was that, any sort of situation that you may get stressed and worked up about, like there's a reason that you're getting stressed and worked up about it, because you're prioritizing, say, for example, you have an interview for a job coming up. So you're prioritizing getting that job over anything else in your life, essentially, because you are getting stressed and worked up about it, and focusing on that future sort of result. And I was talking about the idea of ultimate priorities being like, if your ultimate priority is staying present, that is your priority over doing well on an interview, over getting a good job, over making a lot of money, over having, a successful career in the eyes of the world, like above all of those things. So through everything you do, checking that. And then when it comes to stress, realizing that, I would rather live a stress-free life than, do well on an interview, do well on a presentation. Because when you do put weight on those things, and you do think of those as your sort of priority, you kind of lose that, those ultimate priorities, and you get lost in this idea of achievement and thinking that that's what you need to accomplish. So when you are able to have those sorts of priorities, staying present, reducing stress, then it's like those are what you focus on. And then everything else kind of like drizzles down from that to a degree. And then typically, you end up doing better on those things, because you are staying present and you're not focused on outcome. And going back to, the analogy and example that you talk about a lot with the archer, having one eye on the target and one eye on, hitting it or on the shooting of it. And it's like, when you have one eye on the outcome, you're not able to fully do what you're doing in that moment, whether it be a presentation, interview, test, or anything like that. So when you prioritize, like you mentioned, prioritize that idea of enlightenment, whatever, even if it is made up, when that is your priority, it overcomes any sorts of, accomplishment of anything. And then it's the doing itself. It's the here and now is where you are always. And it's like, that is as close as you can probably get to any idea of enlightenment, is just understanding that here and now is it. And it always has been, and it always will be. And that's who you are. And that's the only thing you'll ever be. And there's nothing more that you have to do. Like, we get caught up in thinking that we have to do more or be more. It's like you can't, it's impossible, and it's futile to even try.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just look at the word enlightenment, however you want to take it, whether you want to take it as lightening the load, right? Or brightening up the environment. Either way, you're dispelling confusion, which is why anybody who's enlightenment will tell you there is no such thing as enlightenment, right? But it's the concept that drives us first. Like there's a lot of people who will be like, yeah, I want to get to enlightenment. I want to achieve that. And that's great. That's really good. In the same way that the Sufis want to connect to God through abandoning their want, right? But there's that catch-22. You have to abandon wanting to meet God as well, right? And so it just comes down to eventually chasing enlightenment. It's the story of the Satori and the woodcutter that we talked about in a previous episode. You have to stop chasing it, right? Eventually, when you get close enough to realizing what it is you're doing, you realize there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to chase. There is nothing left to attain. But it's one thing to say that, and a lot of people do say that, and it's another thing to recognize that genuinely, which is ultimately the point of all of this, right? And anybody who comes to you and says, I am an enlightened master, they're not, right? Because they're still telling you a story. They're still telling you the story they need to tell themselves. Anybody comes up to you and doesn't tell you anything about themselves at all, and they just want to listen to you as you go through your journey, that person's closer to it than any so-called enlightened master ever. Right? Because at least they're paying attention to you. Even your friend you mentioned earlier, who's an atheist. Atheists are closer to God than most believers, right? Because they're not creating a fiction between them and God. They just have a fiction of them to deal with. That's pretty much it, right? It's not like there's two fictions suddenly having to come together. There's just the one that they have to kind of let go of, right? So yeah, it's kind of funny that way. I'm going to move on to my next question because otherwise we're going to keep talking. What do you think about the uprise of veganism? And is it justifiable to eat animal products if it's not a necessity in your individual life? So for example, you can healthily and financially afford to consume only plant-based food products. What is your perspective of that? Should you be a vegan if you can afford to do so, if you can healthily do so, or do you think that it's really up to the person?
Yeah, I mean, so I've never really been driven to have any desire to be vegan or vegetarian or anything like that. I think very much is up to the person, in my opinion. And I was actually thinking about this because I wanted to bring this up again. I know we've touched on this topic before, but I do see like the perspective on the other side of people where it's like, if you see yourself as everything, then it's like, I see where that comes from in like not wanting to kill yourself in that sense. But yeah, I don't know if I have like a great reason or argument as to why. I feel like it's like in practice with veganism and that stuff, what I see is like sort of a high and mighty type attitude in that, like, I'm better because I don't do that and you do. And I always find that interesting in everything when it's like there's a certain situation that plays out in a certain way that it doesn't have to, but it usually does in that way. And so I don't know if I have a great reason as to why I think it doesn't make sense. It just never has really occurred to me. I don't know. Like, I don't see an issue with eating food that isn't human, but it's also like, where is the line then? Because like, I'm not eating humans also. So it's like, is it like a consciousness thing where if it's not self-conscious, then it should be edible? Like, I don't know. I have some questions myself is what I'm trying to say. So I don't know if I have a great answer, but I'm very curious of your perspective. But long story short, I've never really thought about like being vegan or vegetarian. It's just always been a part of my life eating meat. I don't eat as much red meat just because it was harder to digest, I was finding, and I would always like not feel great afterwards. But yeah, I eat meat pretty much every day. Yeah.
That's fair. I've had a great many years to think about this. A lot of people have brought this to my attention, and I've went through it numerous times because, of course, the realization, the genuine recognition that everybody is an extension of you requires you to reanalyze the amount of harm that you're causing to yourself, which we've talked about many times. I don't see any difference between humans and animals. Regardless, then again, I don't see any difference between humans and plants, except, of course, how they can biologically express themselves and the experience that they can have as a result of the form that they take. To me, it's all just awareness. It's all life. But on that token, life has always consumed life in order for life to continue, because life is not separate, right? So when the lion takes down a gazelle, the lion and the gazelle are part of the same goddamn picture. Right. And they look at the Lion King as part of the circle of life. Right. I'm not going to break into song, but the whole point is that, as things die, they go into the ground feeds the rest of the things, and then those things feed the rest of the things, and it just keeps going full circle. And so that's true. Usually when we have an aversion to animals dying, that aversion also comes down to our aversion to us dying. Right. So the more I'm afraid of death, the more I'm afraid of pain, the more opinion I have about the process of dying, or the inevitability of me going into the ground, as it were, the more issue I'm going to have with the idea of other beings dying and going into the ground, because I lack that perspective that I'm not me. I'm not just the individual that I'm choosing to attach myself to, right? So that changes my perspective slightly. There's also this tendency in the vegan community to think that the way we treat animals is like the biggest problem that we have on this planet. And I'm not going to say it's not a huge problem. If you look at factory farms, if you look at the way animals are treated and the shit that's pumped into them repeatedly to make them larger products to sell, the fact that they're not allowed to roam, live, have an existence at all, I mean, that's terrible, and it's brutal. And it's the product of a profit-based economy that's always going to cut corners and always going to sacrifice the integrity and the dignity of people and animals alike. So that is the problem with that system. That's not a problem with eating meat. That's a problem with the way the production of meat has been adopted by this society in order to just keep pushing it out as a product. I mean, you can tell just by the amount of food, if it doesn't get sold, it just gets chucked out. That's it. And the same is true for meat products, right? Like if they produce a large amount of meat for large grocery stores to buy en masse, that order is made regardless of what happens to the meat, regardless if people buy it. So all of those animals were slaughtered on the idea that somebody might buy their dead bodies. That's pointless. That doesn't make any sense, because then we're just encouraging people to eat as much as possible to keep up with the demand, to keep the economy going. And so now you have people eating 4 or 5 cheeseburgers rather than the one that they might need, right? So that all kind of goes into that. So for me, I guess the perspective is that I don't support factory farms. I don't support cruelty to animals for the sake of business. But I grew up around farms. I think I was 4 years old the first time I saw a chicken have its neck snapped, so that way we could eat that chicken. Okay, so that was my jarring introduction to the nature of reality, and so I grew up realizing that that's just how life worked. But on the other hand, those chickens, the cows, the animals had a life. They lived on a farm where they could actually move around and live and exist, and they had a rich, full life. They weren't just stuffed into a container and shipped on a truck in the smallest possible space to save on money, right? Like there was a difference. There was some respect given to the animals. The same with Native American or indigenous practices of hunting. They would say thank you after the hunt, after killing the animal, right? It would be thank you for giving your soul, your spirit to the rest of us to survive, because there was a recognition there is no separation. Indigenous belief actually would go so far as to say that you would take on some of the traits of the animal that you were eating, right? Which they're finding scientifically to not necessarily be too far off the mark, because there is in fact a transference of energy. There is in fact a transference that happens there. Our physiology does get affected, though it's not as cut and dry as the spirit has gone within you, but there is some truth to that. And so all of that in mind, as with everything, everything's gray area. I mean, I'm not going to say don't eat meat, and I'm not going to say just become a vegan, because it's really up to you. You can do whatever you want. If you can afford to just be a vegan and you prefer that diet, and that is the only way for you to minimize your use of factory farms or the industry that drives the cruelty of animals, do that. If you are in a position like I am, where I live on an island that has a great many smaller family farms and a local fishing industry, you can eat meat if you know where that meat is coming from. If you can honestly say that you support the production of that meat or wherever it comes from, and the treatment of the animals, more importantly, you can go ahead and do that. There is no right answer one way or another. Though I will admit, I think the funniest reason I've ever heard from a friend for being a vegan wasn't necessarily because she wanted to save animals, but because she really hated plants.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, I've never heard that perspective there. But yeah, it is interesting. Just, I don't know, in what I see in reality of it comes with a lot of judgment and egotism along with the beliefs of it. And I totally understand where people come from who, don't, because that industry is so fucked up with the factories. And I've, driven past, I've done a lot of road trips through middle America and driven past some of those. And it is a tough scene for sure. But yeah, so.
But the act of eating meat in itself, totally I argument. And I will die by that. I will die on that hill, that the cruelty of animals that is perpetuated by our system is a different argument than whether or not you should eat meat, right? There are considerations there. I'm all for overthrowing that system, not necessarily down with never eating meat again, because I am meat, right? Something's going to eat me, or if it could, it would. I've often said that, right? Like if my situation was reversed, if I was in nature and some animal was hungry and I was by myself, I wouldn't fault it for wanting to eat me, right? That's just its nature. That's part of how it lives. That's the existence that it was born into. And so it's important to keep that in mind, I think. Your question.
All right. Let's see. All right. This is a little bit of a open-ended one related to time. Greetings. I'm feeling I'm running out of time. How can I manage it? Thanks. So I think there is a lot there that, and I don't think it's uncommon to feel like that. And I think a lot of that stems from societal pressures and certain ideals to live up to, and the sort of blueprint that we have for life. I'm not sure. Yeah, I've no idea how old. I can't tell, how old or young this person is, but the idea of, running out of time or feeling like you need to have certain things accomplished by a certain age. I've actually found something I've been thinking of with the idea of, like the whole blueprint of graduating school by 22, having a family by 30 and whatever. And I understand for people who want to have a family, there's certain, biological clocks involved, but outside of that, for the most part, I was thinking of it from the sort of flipped perspective of how old people live. So if you think of your life, someone could live to be 90 versus 70, and potentially someone who has a lot less stress throughout their 15, 20s, 30s may have the opportunity to live longer and still be quite functional at an older age. So in that sense, if you live to be 90, then when you're 40, you have 50 years left, versus if you live to be 70, when you're 20, you have 50 years left. And yet we have insane amount of judgments and perceptions on people who maybe are at a similar stage in life when they're 20 versus 40. Someone who, starts a company, startup, whatever, when they're 20, they're like a kid genius and make $1 million, versus some is like this crazy thing, like they've made it, they're successful, versus when you're 40, if you do the same thing, it's like, oh, whatever. Or just people aren't as patient with things and understand, like everyone tries to have, the get rich quick thing. And there are ways, if you're more patient, it's not nearly as difficult to, build some semblance of wealth, and the feeling that you're running out of time is all just perception of your situation and how other people are perceiving your situation. And I find for the most part, people aren't perceiving other people's situations very much. They're not looking at you and being like, you're running out of time. It's all inside of your own mind, the feelings of running out of time and thinking that you have to, accomplish certain things by a certain age. Like those are all made up constructs and ideas that our society has developed and people have bought into. And now we sort of have this general blueprint that I mentioned. So I think being able to take a step back and look at your situation from a third person perspective, or just realize that you are the awareness of what is, and then you don't have to worry about the third person perspective, but understanding that, the things that you're striving for, questioning those things as well, like the things that you are running out of time for. Again, it's hard to know exactly what this is, whether, if they're talking about dying or if they're talking about accomplishing something. But I think understanding that there's nothing to experience beyond right now, like there is nothing to do outside of right now. So if there are things you want to work on or do or accomplish, like doing them now is the only time and place you can, here and now is the only time and place you can ever do them. So understanding that, it's like time sort of gets removed from the equation, and then there's no time to run out of because time isn't there anymore. It's an illusion to begin with. And understanding that, I think, can help at least ease those feelings, despite the fact, as I mentioned, that they're primarily 99.9% of the time complete, if not 100% of the time, completely made up based on societal pressures, perceptions, and constructs.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that our collective belief in science and control works against us to some degree, because as we've been able to exercise more control medically over death, our lifespan has increased. And now we have this idea that, well, the average lifespan is, 70 to 80 years old. And so we have almost this expectation that we're going to live to 70 or 80 years old, right? And so it's like, oh, I feel like I'm running out of time. It's like, you could die tomorrow. You could leave your house today and die, right? And so it comes down to, if that were to happen, and it may, are you good with it? And if not, that's what you have to work on. That should be your priority, because it's all well and good to think, when I get to 50, I'm going to have this much money, unless you never get to 50, in which case you just pissed away all of the moments that you did have for some date that's never going to happen, right? So it's a balance, as with everything, right? It just comes down to, I'm going to plan for the future as best I can, but I'm not going to assume it's going to happen the way I think it will. I'm not going to assume that everything's going to lay out the way I think it will in my mind, or the way other people have told me, because nothing in life does work out that way. Everything is gray area. Everything is unknown, right? So if you think that if you always feel like you're running out of time, it's because you're too focused on time, right? That's pretty much it. You're just dwelling on how much you have left, and you're dwelling on a fiction that you ultimately don't know. So as long as you have here and now, you still have time, in which case, work on that, enjoy that to the best of your ability. That will ultimately, that practice will help you feel not only like you have more time, but like you're eternal. And that does happen over time, but it is over time. It does happen now, but it is a process of practicing being here now, to the point where you realize that your perception of time isn't what you think it is, right? And you're focused on it specifically for a sense of certainty. That's it.
Yeah, certainly. I think, yeah, and it's all about balance like that. I feel like I get a lot of questions about, oh, like live present, like, well, I'll just stop saving money and give all my money away. And, oh, I'm homeless. Thanks a lot. And I'm like, oh my God, like, give me a break. But at the same time, like, I understand people like, taking things to extremes and whatnot. And I think it's important to realize that you can plan here now. Like, the difference between worrying and planning. It's like worrying is an action that you're taking here and now. And it's not that you have to put all of your weight on it and think and take it as truth necessarily, but through doing it, having some preparation, giving yourself a destination, or not a destination, but a path or direction through the planning, but then not taking it seriously and understanding that the odds of it actually playing out exactly like you planned are essentially zero, and being okay with that. And so between balancing that and then on the worry side of it is like, worrying is just, you're not accomplishing, it's not accomplishing anything, and it's all focused on existing in the future. It's not something you're doing. Well, it is something you're doing now, but it's not like the action that planning is necessarily. It's like there is a action oriented aspect to it versus a, I don't know, almost mindless passive. Like, I think so like, okay, so it's like planning is your mind is the servant and worrying is your mind is the master. So like planning, you are using your mind as a tool, because as humans, it is a incredible tool that we have the ability to perceive the past and the future. But it is a tool. And most people that I have interacted with, it is their master. And the question you have to ask yourself is, if I wanted to stop thinking and worrying, could I? And if the answer is no, then it's your master. And that's where, your attention your attention can just be here now. And then it all, goes away or at least begins to get better anyway. But, if that is where it is, where you can't necessarily turn it off, then that is something to work on.
Now that's interesting. It just dawned on me that, well, it's dawned on me before, but it's a good way to come at it this time. Is the more you're focused on your character, the more you're focused on your idea of yourself, the more you're focused on your narrative. And the narrative always exists in time.
Yes.
So the two go together. That was an interesting insight. I like that one. Okay, next question. Of course, this one is one I've been looking forward to getting to, because it's another one about religion. How does one get over religious trauma, specifically feeling guilty or fearful when leaving a belief system?
Right. I feel like in my situation, which is pretty much all I can speak to, it wasn't necessarily like an overnight thing. It was very much a process, and it started with, like, I still was nominally Catholic, and it's relatively recent for me. It's been probably progressing since halfway through college. So I don't know, 5 years it's been processing. And I think it started out with, I just, half of the stuff I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't believe that part of it. And I was still like, the last part was believing in God and like a higher power. And eventually it was just like less and less made any sense. And I was like, all right, I believe, like 10% of what they're talking about. Like, why am I still identified as, Catholic? So then that kind of went away. And then I still believed in God, but I would question it, like, what's really going on. And then I got to a point where I was fully like sort of out of that. And I think in my experience, it hasn't been as much where people tell me that I should think differently or that I should be afraid, but it's that they don't like when I bring it up, and I just don't as much, because it's quite frankly just not worth, when we're talking about like stress and stuff like that, it's just not worth my energy to try and convince anyone. And we can argue whether that's even possible anyway. But yeah, I mean, having a place like, our Discord and Patreon, and people that you can talk to about it, places you can go to talk about things. Like, I know with my situation, people close to me still being involved, like being able to talk about it on a podcast every week and kind of talk through belief systems and all of that can be very helpful. So I think having people that you can talk to who are in a similar boat, who kind of have been on the other side, and that can be super helpful in and of itself. In terms of, I don't know if I have a great perspective on if you're in a situation where people are like more hostile about it. I think maybe Ray may have a little bit more experience, just because you've been through it longer, and I don't know, but possibly because I feel like I don't have that much, where I was always growing up in an environment that it was religious, but it wasn't like crazy religious. It was like everyone was kind of like, yeah, we're gonna like hold on to it because we're scared of death, but like we're not, pushing it on anyone. We're we used to go to mass like a couple times a year. Now it's like just Christmas and Easter. And I was even like, do we really, like, it's the same thing every year? Like we could just, go to dinner a little earlier or something. And I didn't actually say that, but I was thinking it because I know that wouldn't be received well. But yeah, so I'll let Ray speak to this as well now.
That's kind of funny. It's like, I'm just going to assume Ray has pissed off more people. It's just so.
Well, yeah.
this one actually resonates pretty strongly with me, because growing up, I didn't have much of a support. I didn't have parents. I was always kind of, I felt like I didn't have any value or worth. And so religion was my first life preserver. It was the thing that I reached to for that sense of certainty and security. And it meant a lot to me. I was what you would call a devout Christian. I really was. I read the Bible. I prayed. I did the rosary. I did the whole thing. And it was exactly because of that my rejection of Christianity later on was so strong, was because I was such a devout believer, only to find all of those lessons within Christianity, while they sound pleasant and while they offer you some sense of certainty and purpose and an idea of who you are, actually just get you farther and farther from the truth. They take you farther and farther down a road of being self-critical, where you're never going to meet God. You're never going to feel worthy. You're never going to, unless of course you just continue to tell yourself, Jesus loves me, because you're never going to meet Jesus. And so you're never actually going to have him tell you, I love you, you're doing great. So you're always just telling yourself a narrative, right? And so I leaned really hard on that. And when I came out of it, there was a lot of leftover programming, let's just say that. And I dealt with that probably into my late 20s, if I'm honest about it. And it's just because the idea of God was so solid for me. It was so pivotal to me. Everything in my life was built around this idea that there's a God. And so it took me a while, once I realized that, that God's a concept, actually, what they're pointing at is a state of being. Didn't understand that at all. So I would immediately go, oh, maybe I shouldn't be questioning these things. I actually had a friend say to me, do you think maybe there are certain things we're not meant to question? Which just set me off. I'm like, no, obviously if I can do it, I'm meant to do it, right? And so that was kind of the point there. But all throughout that process of recognizing that the narrative wasn't the truth, that the religion itself was the result of people misunderstanding and investing in their ego more than anything to do with God, the more I started to hear this fear of, oh, you're going to go to hell. God's judging you. What if you're leaving the path? What if you're wrong? What if when you die, you're really going to go? And so all of this old programming kept popping up, and it sounded very much just like a horde of screaming demons behind me, just wanting my attention. Just pay attention to these thoughts, right? Because they had always been there. But that's what it is. It's programming. It's habitual thought. That's all it is. It's the fact that it was some of your earliest programming, which is even harder to let go of, because you were a child when this stuff was drilled into you, or at least it was in my case. And so it becomes foundational to everything else you perceive, just like Andrew was saying earlier, right? It's one of those perspectives that alters everything else you do. The perspective of a division between you and God. More importantly, the perspective of a gatekeeper in Jesus or anybody else, that you have to go through to get to God. Like all of these things create a story about you as not being worthy, as not being capable of connecting to God now, that you are a sinner. And so as you start to question that, as you start to look more into the Bible, where the stories came from, what actually happened to the people who first told those stories at the hands of the people who then wrote those stories down. When you start looking into, we have a question here about the book of Revelations. When you start looking into the origin of Revelation, you immediately start having questions. And so, as we said before the podcast, the reason most Christian people, the reason most religious people don't question, they don't look into the history, they don't look into, where these things actually came from, they'll just tell you it's the word of God and leave it at that, is because as soon as you do start looking into it, as soon as you start questioning it, it starts to fall apart. It starts to become harder and harder and harder to give it credibility. And so that's part of that process. The other part of that process is recognizing it yourself, is recognizing that the farther you get from the dogma, the farther you get away from the character that they're telling you are, the closer you're getting to the state of mind of people who actually managed to achieve the experience of God that the Bible was based on. You'll have ears to hear, you'll have eyes to perceive, rather than just looking at other people's misinterpretations based on their own ego and based on their own need for control. It's one thing I've always found funny about Christianity, and I've said it before, is that Christians, more than following Jesus, follow the apostles that didn't understand Jesus. I always find that really interesting. It's like, oh, if we quote Matthew, it's like, right, I thought you were a Christian. Aren't we talking about Jesus? Right? And if we look at just the things that Jesus said, most of Christianity doesn't line up with it. Right? So it really just comes down to just keep questioning, and that trauma will start to go away. But in the case, and as Andrew said, sometimes you're in a toxic environment and the people around you are not going to enjoy these questions. Choose your battles. Right? On the one hand, you don't need to prove anything to them if you're recognizing it yourself. And as you are recognizing it yourself, you will find that they are going to distance themselves from you almost naturally. Oil and water. It's just because you're not in a state of mind that makes them comfortable with their narrative anymore. As soon as you start questioning it, you start to exclude yourself from that club, right? Which is why it's often an aggressive response to questioning. It's often, a hostile reaction to your questioning. And it's not because you shouldn't question, it's because they depend on you not questioning in order for them to sustain the false sense of security that they have, right? In which case, let those people go. It doesn't have to. And one more warning, and this is super important, is that it is just as easy to get caught up in being a Christian as it is to get caught up in being an ex-Christian, right? You can, by just identity alone, pit yourself against the church, against religion as a whole. And that in itself is its own religion. That is a problem, right? Like, I've had numerous people come to one of my videos from back in 2005. They're listening, boom, I mentioned Jesus once. They're like, oh, you mentioned Jesus, I'm out. It's like, wow, I can see Christianity really programmed you, right? Meanwhile, they're thinking, oh, it's just Christians that are programmed. No, you're holding on to an idea too. You are just as stuck on that concept that you can't now look at the insight behind it, right? So there is nothing wrong with just not defining yourself, looking at all sources as possible, ways to find insight. But you don't have to be against something. Just don't use it. Just don't do it. Just don't be a Christian. That's enough. That's all you have to do, right? You don't have to try and take down the church. The church is going to fall apart on its own, right? You know the fruit by the tree that bears it. Right. And the fruit that comes out of the Vatican has always been divisive. Out of religion as a whole will always continue to be based on the ego. It will always continue to divide you from the rest of reality. So just keep knowing that, and the trauma will eventually fade, and you will start causing some trauma for the people who don't want to let that go. Not intentionally, just because you are in fact enjoying your life, enjoying the realization of God, which is unfortunately, and this is probably one of the saddest parts about being religious, you can't experience God. It's all hearsay, right? When you're religious, when you're a believer, all you've ever done is heard about God, heard about the experience of being connected, and you're following hearsay, where the alternative is to actually have the experience. And then all of that programming just stops making sense, and it becomes easier to shed it and move on. But as with everything else, time and attention and priority, and it will eventually change.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating just how interesting all of that is with holding on to it, and how quick people are to jump from a belief system to another belief system that they have just left, whether it's anti their past belief system or just cycling through another sort of belief system. Do you think that's part of like, I don't know, I don't want to say human nature, but kind of like wanting to hold on to something? Or do you think there's so much just fear within us all the time about, people's fears of death, and they try and hold on to it? Or do you think they're just so tied to the idea and illusion of division that they almost need something to believe in order to soothe the inevitable fears that come with feeling like you're divided?
That's a really good question. I posted a video about this earlier last year, and it was just something that came to me as I was walking and talking to my wife. And I think it comes down to this. The human brain evolved over time and created a frontal cortex, which gives us the ability to look at multiple scenarios. It gives us the ability to really conceptualize time, right? Conceptualize what could happen, numerous stages or numerous points down the road. But our reptilian brain doesn't understand that. It doesn't understand that this new part of the brain can perceive things that aren't real, right? And so our reptilian brain, which is all fight or flight, suddenly perceives an identity, an idea of ourself. And it perceives it in the same way it perceives our body, as us. So we have an idea of who we are, and our reptilian brain goes, oh shit, that's you. I got to keep you alive. I got to keep you safe, right? And so now our brain unknowingly is protecting the fiction of our identity because we think it's us, right? The brain doesn't understand that it can lie to itself. It doesn't understand it has two different parts that are working entirely different. And so we have to kind of train ourselves to recognize that's a product of our brain, right? The idea that we are an idea is something that our brain keeps trying to grasp onto. And it's only through recognizing that it's not the truth. And I mean this collectively. If we could get this into our schooling system, if we could actually make this a part of our culture, everything would change. Everything would change. But until we have the conversation that our brain is fooling us, we're going to continue to fall into this trap. Doesn't matter what it is, which is why I always find the atheist argument to be so interesting, right? Because normally the atheist argument is just, I don't know if there's a God or not. There's no proof. I'm going to leave it at that, which is great because it's kind of open-ended, right? But sometimes the atheist argument is there is no God, right? In which case, okay, so now you've just identified, you just come up with an idea again that your brain is presenting you because you don't want to believe in that fiction. So now you've created another assumption. You've created another fiction to balance out that uncertainty. Just don't commit to it. That's all it is. That's where agnostics tend to be closer to the point than atheists. Agnostics will just say, I don't know. Could be. Not even sure I have the right questions or the right answers for that, right? Like it's just look at it for what it is, right? But it really just comes down to, until we understand that our brain creates a reality that we experience. Until we can understand that our brain will go, oh, here's a perception and everything that goes with it. And we start to question that, we're always going to end up falling into illusions. We're always going to end up falling into distortion, not recognizing that it comes from us. And so this is why I've often said that, practices like meditation, Zen, even being a Jedi, I mean, it's all really just comes down to self-awareness. What are you investing in as a thought or as an identity or a narrative about yourself? And what reality is that creating? Because if you can come to terms with that, like I'll give you an example. I'll go and I'll have a conversation with religious people. And in that conversation, it can get quite heated. At no point do I walk away from that going, yeah, that defines me. That reflects on me as a value. It's just a conversation. It's just something that's happening, right? And the less committed I am to being any particular part in that conversation, the more easily I'm able to move around within that conversation, to move with their perspectives, to work with what they're saying and find other insights in that. Whereas if I'm just focusing on my perspective, there is no God, there is no Jesus, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to catch anything from that conversation. They're not going to catch anything because I'm just telling them they're wrong and trying to validate myself the entire damn time, right? So we're not going to grow as people. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's just recognizing that we are illusion machines, right? Like our brain is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful. You can literally think to yourself right now, I'm going to go out this afternoon. What if I run into somebody on the street who's drunk and aggressive, and then not leave your house because you're afraid of that happening? That's incredible if you think about it. The placebo effect, likewise, is incredible. So we're just starting to scratch the surface on a conversation about exactly how powerful our consciousness is, about exactly how tricky our mind can be. But we're not having that conversation yet. Right now, we're talking about like God and the devil, right? Right now, we're talking about, two different sides. And it's like, no, there is no devil. The devil is just the perception that appears to be truth. The master of lies, the father of lies, right? It's just, the perception is never the truth. The perception is always just a perception. And it may dictate the experience, but only so long as you're invested in it as truth, right? And so it really just, it's the one-step process we always talk about, right? Self-awareness. That's pretty much it. Is it your question or mine?
I believe it's mine, right? That was a Patreon question. Yeah. Okay. Last one from Instagram. Have you met the machine elves? So I think this is in relation to psychedelic. A lot of people, is that what this talked about typically?
Usually ayahuasca, but it's not the only drug for sure.
Yeah. I feel like that's, I don't know, maybe people will perceive that experience I had when I, made that video about, talking to God. And I talked about on, was it last week's or the week before's episode of, talking to God. And when I got to this place within myself, I saw these little, cartoon characters, and that could be, I think, similar to what people express as the machine elves. And so when I got there, I've already talked about this in a previous episode, but I'll just run through it again quick because it's, I think, related to the question. I saw them and I was like, immediately, I knew where I was without ever having been there, but also having been there. And I was like, oh, so there's a few of you. And that was because that was the first question. They immediately turned into one being. And that in itself, that experience just made it very clear to me. And then they went from one sort of blob being to, a tree, and then a few other shapes. And they were like, we are whatever you perceive us to be. We are everything and nothing, just based on your perception of us or me, or whatever words you want to throw in there. But so yeah, that was my sort of experience, but it was very interesting. And I think, I don't know, I haven't read or looked into the idea of the machine elves as much, but do you think that is a sort of realm that's similar to what I experience in a lot of ways that people sort of go through as a sort of experience within yourself that's, that is yourself, and it's just for whatever reason, that's how people perceive them? Like, I'm curious, why do you think people call them machine elves? Is that just the most common way that people have experienced them? Okay.
It is. I've ran across them a few times. It's really interesting because, of course, we've talked about awareness, and all things within awareness has to exist somewhere at some point, right? And that's all one thing. So it's entirely possible that on some planet far, far away in a distant time and space, there are elves that manage to blend with machines and whatnot. But the symbolism is what's interesting to me, because every conversation I've ever had, conversation with the machine elves, has always been along the lines of our potential as a species. It's always been, this is what you're capable of. It's always been, if you can find balance, this is something you can become or reflect in yourself. And so what I find interesting about the machine elf symbolism is that when we think about elves, typically we're looking at ancient beings with wisdom that lived in alignment with nature. That is the entire mythology around elves. But machine elves have managed to use that knowledge with technology in balance. And so there's the symbolism of what we're capable of doing, of finding that balance, of in fact being these ancient beings. I mean, it's because of the mythology of elves and everything that goes into that. Thanks, Tolkien. That affects a lot of what we're experiencing for sure, because somebody who's never read anything to do with elves would more than likely see them as something else, and which is often why you have people who have more of a Christian background seeing angels, right? But it's all symbolism. It's all symbolism for our awareness and what's possible. And then, of course, we see a possibility in our potential, and our brain comes up with a symbolic way to represent that possibility and allow us to communicate with that possibility within ourselves. And of course, based on what we have experienced, what we've looked at in the world, what we've absorbed as context, our brain creates a symbolic representation of that insight. And so we interact with that symbolic representation until you start questioning it too far, in which case the symbolism falls apart and then you end up talking to something else entirely, which is exactly what happened to you and has happened with me multiple times. I mean, to anybody who has in fact talked to the techno elves, as it were, just start asking them more questions. You know, aren't you just me? And watch what they become, because it changes the flow. But it's all symbolism. It's really just all of us accessing parts of our awareness that we're not necessarily in a state of mind to understand, without something to bridge the gap, without something to act as kind of an intermediary between our state of mind and the state of mind that we're communicating with. And so we come up with characters as a result of that process.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's something that has become clear with some of my trips, is just the perceptions, and you're able, and then just like when my eyes aren't closed and I'm seeing things here, it's just like very much peeled back and able to see things just more clearly without all of as many of my perceptions. But I think it kind of seems like no matter what, there's going to be something that's still sort of there as your individual perception of things. And that's why, people, when they have experiences like that and they have sorts of beliefs about things, that's what they see. They see it based on their perception. And I have, so another interesting story, kind of about, this is family related, but my little brother, when he was younger, like 2, apparently saw Jesus above our neighbor's house, who had just passed away, but like we didn't know they had passed away yet. They were like 85 or 90, and he was like a little baby. So, my mom thought that was like, the craziest thing ever. And it kind of like reaffirmed her beliefs in things like that, because how could, a 2-year-old say that about?
Must have been Jesus.
Yeah. And so now hearing, remembering that, it's like, that's just how it was perceived because of the stories and narratives that you've been told. It's like, oh, it has to be that. What else could it possibly be? And it's like, there's nothing saying that it has to be that, except for your perceptions and the things that you have been taught to believe.
Yeah. So it comes down to, what did he see? Right. And if the only way for him to translate what he was experiencing was the image of Jesus, which was the closest thing he had been taught that resembled that kind of energy or that kind of insight, makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, because I think, I don't know exactly what was said. My mom could probably tell me, but I think it was something like, I see a bearded man above that house or something. And it's like, oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Well, and this is it, right? I mean, hallucinations or symbolism or visuals or whatever you want, visions, I mean, they've always been relied upon by mystics as well, right? Because there's symbolism and there's meaning behind that symbolism. But then again, you can't take the symbolism at face value, because as soon as you do that, you've discounted everything behind it. And you went, no, it's just the symbol. It's like, well, whatever that symbol means to you, but you're not the person who had that vision. So it doesn't really matter, right? Speaking of symbolism, and actually this is a perfect segue into another supporter question. What do you think of the Book of Revelations?
I don't know if I should start this one off. I think I may be able to chime in on certain things, because I've not spent very much time looking into it at all. Like, it was part of my teachings growing up, I'm sure. Like, we read from a lot of different books in Sunday school, and I went to Catholic school from 5th grade through high school. But yeah, specifically, I don't know if I can start this one off.
That's fair. I think it's important to recognize first that there's a lot of assumptions around the Book of Revelation, specifically a lot of assumptions around the name John that's ascribed to the Book of Revelations. Most people don't go and look at the fact that has nothing to do with John, any John that's in the New Testament. whatsoever. Actually, it's based on a guy named John the Elder, who lived in Asia Minor about 100 years after Jesus was killed, or rather about 100 years approximately after Jesus was killed. And so he'd never met Jesus, didn't live anywhere near where Jesus was from, and at the time was a Christian who was in direct contradiction to Rome and the expansion of Rome. And so the book of Revelation starts off with, there's like 7 letters to the different churches, expressing the need for this revitalization of Christianity, essentially expressing that, there's this great evil coming and that we need to believe if we're going to stop this. And then it goes into this big symbolic story of how that evil is going to rise. And it goes according to many different stages. And the problem with the symbolism is that if you don't know the history, it all sounds terrifying, right? Like monsters coming out of the sea, and there's trumpets and there's angels and there's all kinds of stuff. And you're like, Jesus, what the hell's happening here? But if you actually go and you look at the symbolism and you look at the history at the time, specifically about John and his opposition to Rome, it makes perfect sense, because he's talking specifically about the expansion of Rome and their response to Christianity. Like at one point, he talks about, I wrote this down, the 5 fallen, right? In Revelations, they talk about the 5 fallen. What he is talking about are the 5 emperors of Rome that had died prior to that, right? That was the point. He was talking about the Roman Empire. That's all he was talking about. He refers to one who has been wounded, which was Nero. Nero was an emperor who had died of a wound, right? And so he's talking about the Roman Empire. He's talking about the beast rising from the sea and the number of the beast and all that. He's talking about the money that was ascribed to Rome, right? The dollars or the coins that were Caesar's. He's talking about all of that. And it's all about how if you're a member of the Roman Empire, you're essentially serving the beast. That's all Revelation was meant to be. It was meant to be rhetoric and mythology to scare people into line and get them to follow Christianity rather than the dominant religion at the time. It's the same reason that Genesis, for example, focuses on a snake and a woman being the biggest problem. It just happens to be that when Genesis was written, the only other dominant religion in the area worshipped snakes and women as their mythology, as their symbolism for the religion. And so how do you stomp out another religion? You make their symbolism evil, right? And so everything just comes back down to marketing and public relations. And that's very much what the book of Revelations is. It's just more fear tactic. It's just more rhetoric in order to get people to agree with you. And when you read it, if you're not just a devout, like, oh, Jesus is coming and I'm righteous and everything else, it's very easy to see that the story is bunk. It doesn't mean anything. It really is it's pleasant imagery, or it's interesting imagery at the very least, but there's nothing insightful in there. There's really nothing of use whatsoever, because it's just a fever dream of somebody who is fanatical about their belief and their identity that went with it, because they were opposed to some other evil. And so there's a lot of ego that goes in that. And so everything in that story kind of reinforces that. That's my perspective of Revelations, at least. Out of everything in the New Testament, it's the first thing that should get tossed on the fire.
So was it basically created so when people read it, is it like kind of like a scary story about what's going to happen if you don't believe, essentially, is what I'm getting?
Oh, no, not just if you don't believe. It's a story of the end times. It's a story about the apocalypse coming, about what's happening on Judgment Day. Like it's a story about how the end of the world will come about, how the dead will rise, how like it's a terrifying story. At the end of the day, man, like you could make a series of movies out of it, and people would go, that was a bit far-fetched. Like it really is. It's a hell of a story, but none of it's real. It's all based on this fear of judgment and this idea that God judges itself, and that some of us are living according to a plan and others are not, and blah, blah, blah. It's all just vilification and identity and ego, but it's a hell of a story, and it'll scare the crap out of anybody who doesn't look into where it came from.
Yeah. I will, I don't know. Would you recommend I look into it further? Or...
Just for shits and giggles, maybe. Yeah. I mean, like, it's just, if you're sitting down at home one day and you got a cold beer or something, you want to get a good giggle, yeah, sure, crack it open. But I mean, if you're looking into it for some sense of what's coming in the end times, don't waste your time. It's really not worth it. I mean, it's just fiction. It's by far the least useful part of the New Testament. by far. And they just included it at the end because it really seals that deal, right? Like if you think about it, it really just hammers the point home. Like, you know, Jesus, 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 love, 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 end of the world. If you don't follow us, you're going to die. Okay, sold. Right? And that's pretty much what it comes down to, right? So try and consider that if you're reading Revelations, that it really is the end of a sales pitch. You know, always be closing is what we were taught in sales, and that's exactly what Revelations does.
Yeah, it's like if the rest of this didn't convince you, hopefully this one drives it home. And I really do see that in a lot of ways, that it's the fear that keeps people holding on. It's like that fear of like, oh, what if you're wrong? You know, you don't want all this bad shit to happen to you. And like that's how I see it playing out in people close to me who, you know, they don't really believe much of it, but they still hold on because they're afraid of what if they're wrong, or what if, you know, what if it is all correct? You know, you can't disprove it. It's like, oh, give me a break.
That's the funny part, right? It's like, we're going to come up with a story that's going to make you feel like you know what's going to happen after death, and just happen to make you afraid that it's not going to happen, or that something else is going to happen, instead of just going, you know, there's no death. Life is eternal. That's why I always find it really interesting that in I think it was Mark, Jesus actually scolds his apostles. And he's like, you know, you're not listening. God is of the living, right? Like there's no afterlife. You're not getting this. And it's true. In the New Testament, Jesus never once refers to life after death. Like he's never talking about an afterlife. What he's saying is that heaven is here now, that you can, you know, be at the right side of the Father, as it were, as you can be in alignment with reality. Right. And yet Christianity has created this idea of like the afterlife and heaven and hell and all that based on Dante's Inferno, which was written like 1,000 years after the fact. Right. So it just became this romanticized idea that if you don't believe in us, you're going to burn. Right. There was, there's this great documentary. It's called Jesus Camp. I definitely recommend that you watch it. And it was back in the days when George Bush Jr. was president. But essentially, it's about these children that go to this camp to learn about Jesus and of course to learn how to support the Republican Party, which is really, really interesting. Yeah, I know. But what I always found funny is, just to drive it home, Jesus Camp, which is for children, is held at the Lake of Fire campsite. Just to drive it home. You're going to hell, right? But I encourage you to watch that documentary and what they do to children. It's terrible. The children are terrified. They're so scared that they're going to go to hell if they don't pray to Jesus. I knew that very well, you know, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, you know, or going to, you know, God help me if I die, take my soul, right? That kind of thing. It's always on death, always, always, always. And I know when I was going into church, it's like, you know, oh, look, the stained glass. There's a guy bleeding and hanging on a cross. Like that's everywhere. It's like, do you really think that that was the image that he wanted to leave us with? Like, look at the movie, The Passion of the Christ. It was just about him dying. There was nothing about his passion. There was nothing about what he was talking about. It wasn't about the story. It was about how he died, because Christians love to focus on that. They will focus on that rather than how he lived, what he said. What would Jesus do? Right? Well, let's talk about that. Let's not just talk about he would die. End of story. That kind of ruins the story, right? Like, there's nowhere else to go with that.
Yeah, damn. Yeah, I still remember when I was younger, because I went to school I went to from 5th grade to 9th grade was very, very Catholic conservative, and they would hold confession like monthly. And I remember everyone would like get all nervous going up to it, and then everyone feels so good afterwards. And I remember thinking like, oh, I could die and I'm going straight to heaven. It was like the greatest feeling ever. Honestly, it was like, it was kind of equivalent to like how I feel most of the time now, but it was that sort of feeling of just like relief. Like there's not really anything to be afraid of, because, you know, I have nothing to lose. I'm going straight to heaven if I die right now, as long as I don't, you know, have a, you know, lustful thought in the meantime or something.
As long as I don't fuck it up.
Yeah. Which probably, you know, happened. Technically, I probably committed some sort of sin by the end of that day. So
can't help it, really, right? Like that's the Christian thing I always found kind of funny. It's like, you can't escape being a sinner. You can't. It doesn't matter how much you believe in Jesus. It doesn't matter how much you convince other people to believe in Jesus. It doesn't matter what you do, because you were born of original sin. You were born from sex. How do you get out of that one?
Yeah.
Right? You can't. But that's why I always find the etymology of sin to be so interesting, right? It was never a hell-worthy trespass. It was just missing the point. That's all it means, is missing the mark. It's literally the etymology. It's an archery thing, just like everything else, right? But it's just missing the mark, which all believers do. They all miss the point. So believers are sinners. So Christianity's got it right.
Very true. All right. Should we move on? Next question. Let us see. All right, moving over to TikTok comments. All right. What are your thoughts on having children, both personally and for others in general? That is a interesting question. That I mean, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with having children. I have a child myself, but on the other hand, I think that it's really important to recognize that it's very easy to get caught up in the societal narrative, again, that you won't be happy until you are married and have a child or two and a house and a white picket fence and the whole thing, right? Often people who do have children, as a result of checking off the list, don't have much of a relationship with those children. As they get older, they get put into school, and then you see them for maybe 2 or 3 hours in the evening for 12 years of their life, and then they move on, they go to university, and so on and so forth. And so it's so important, if you are in that situation, to change and grow as a person with your child, right? And this is so important as a parent. You can't be a parent and then just look down at your child like, you're here to learn, I'm here to teach, because then you're not growing, and all your child is learning from you is how to not grow. They're just learning how to stagnate, right? And so if you can continue to question everything you think you are, if you can continue to question everything you think you know, if you can set yourself in a state of mind where you're at least willing to look at things afresh for the sake of sharing an experience with another being, then parenthood's probably going to be really good for you. You're going to really enjoy that, right? But if you're always just trying to self-validate, if you're always just trying to feel like you're a teacher or you're an authority or anything else, then you may as well just become the warden of a prison, because you'll get more enjoyment out of that. On the other token, we have over 7 billion people on the planet, and a huge population problem. And that's not going to go away until we start taking children and the process of having children slightly more seriously. And so in my case, I had one child, and then I had a vasectomy. That was it. I was done. No more children. And the reason is because I want to put as much time and attention into the one child that I do have. The other point is the fact that the world is very quickly going to start going through a scarcity issue. Our children are going to start suffering through certain things that are the result of the way we live and the way that our parents lived before us. That's going to be quite difficult. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're considering whether or not to have children, that whether or not it's a good time for you today doesn't mean that it's going to be a good time for them 20 years from now. And so that's something that you should consider. If you're going to have a child, have a child. If you're going to have 2 children, think about why you're having children, right? That's my only piece of advice. And it's not because there's anything wrong with having more than one child, but I think it's important to recognize that habit or that, I guess, practice of having numerous children is from a different era of humanity. I mean, back when we were clans, back when having a large family was necessary to help you till the farm and help support the crop and the town or the village that you lived in, the community, having a large amount of people to help you and grow up, that was a big thing. But now that's not the same thing. We're not clans anymore, and families don't necessarily stick together where blood is stronger than water anymore, because we don't have that familial need to support one another, to stay in constant contact. And so things have changed incredibly, right? So often you have people who have 4 or 5 children, and those 4 or 5 children grow up and never talk to them again, right? And that wasn't the case 200 or 300 years ago, when those 4 or 5 children would go on to continue on the family business, or continue on supporting the community, or to continue on the farm, or that kind of thing. So it's just important to recognize, why are you having children? If you're doing it just to make your life better, it's probably not the best reason. If you're doing it because you are whole and complete in yourself, and you want to share that with another being that's going to contribute to the world, awesome. Have children.
Yeah, it's funny going back to thinking about being at that Catholic school, like around middle school for myself. There were some families at that school with 8 to 10 children. Like it was wild. And so, yeah, so my perspective, I'm not having doing that right now. I'm not in that mindset. I don't think I'm even very close to it at the moment. I'm in no rush whatsoever. I think I'll want to have at least a kid or two, but I'm not like, it's not this like thing that I have in my mind that I need to, carry on my legacy through children or whatever the hell that is. And I think a lot of people do, as you mentioned, get caught up in the societal pressures of having kids. It's like, and this question, I don't know who asked it, who they are, what perspective they're coming from, but I think it seems like in my experience, a lot of women feel that pressure and they feel it building as they get to a certain age. And I understand, if you want to have kids, there is a sort of clock involved, certainly. But at the same time, it's like, I think it's just a lot of like pressure. And we've talked about so many times, like the societal norms and like the bell curve of society. And like most people have kids. So if you do something that's different, like whether it's not having kids or dyeing your hair green, like people, because it's not the norm, it stands out. And it's like, or even just like not going to college as a kid, like just going to start working and to start making money because you'd rather do that than go to school for 4 years. Like it's not a crazy thing at all, but because most people go to college, most people have children, most people don't dye their hair green, it's become these sorts of societal expectations where it's almost like you need a reason why you're doing it. And so it builds up this immense pressure and it just like doesn't make much sense because why does it matter to someone else if someone else has children? Why does it matter to someone else what someone else's hair color is? Why does it matter to someone else what someone else goes to school or what their job is or what they do on a day-to-day basis at all or how they live their life or what they eat or any of these things? It blows my mind all the time that people have opinions on these things of other people's lives. So yeah, long story short, for me, I'm in no rush. I'm not 100% gonna have a child, certainly not anytime soon. Like I have things that I want to do with my life, and I know that I'm very aware that having a child is a massive responsibility, and I can't do some of the things that I want to do. I'm not going to be traveling around Europe or Southeast Asia with a baby on my back. Like, it's not something that I am ready for right now or want. And it's also like, I think, at least historically speaking, statistically speaking, having, two parents in the home is more of a environment conducive to being able to raise a child, in, I don't know, I don't want to say better or worse, but like in a way that is more beneficial to them if they don't have that in their environment. So, I don't even have a girlfriend right now. Like I'm not having a kid before I have at least a girlfriend or
It's very
something
difficult.
that I want to, be with for a long period of time. Like I'm going to take the precautions until that day comes. And yeah, so that's my perspective.
I agree. I think that's a great perspective. I mean, at least it's honest to what you want to do and how you see your life. And I think that's really important. And again, it's free of that societal expectation, right? But it's funny because our society really does reject everything that's beyond the norm. And even though some movies start to touch on it, by the end of the movie, they just do a complete about face and end up going right back in the common narrative. There's a Christmas movie. I can't stand it. I can't stand like the last 10 minutes of it. The rest of the movie's great. It's called Four Christmases. It's with Reese Witherspoon and oh God, I can't remember his name. It's from Fred Claus. Anyway, the point is that it's called Four Christmases, and it's about this couple who aren't married, don't want children. And it starts off with them in a ballroom dancing class, and everybody who's there taking the class is getting married. And they're like, "Oh, when are you getting married?" And they're like, "We're not. we just enjoy learning how to ballroom dance. After this, we're going to go play some squash and we're going to do this. And it's like, oh, well, why aren't you married? And so they go through all the reasons, like, why would we have to be, right? We're already together and we're already enjoying this. Why would we need to go through all that? And it makes all the people who are getting married super uncomfortable, right? It's just because, and so the movie goes on to show how they have to visit all of their family members in 4 different Christmases, right? In 4 different situations. And the whole movie is showing how this need to consistently be in the same narrative of people who are your family but are toxic doesn't really serve a purpose. It doesn't really have anything it doesn't make a good Christmas. Let's just put it that way, right? So the movie's hilarious. It goes all the way through to the last 10 minutes where all of a sudden the main character makes a point, well, I think we should get married and I think we should have children. And then the other character's like, oh, I don't think that's the case. And by the end of the movie, they do. They go right back to the common narrative. It just does such a 180. About 10 minutes towards the end of the movie, you're just like, yeah, this hit the executive's desk. And they went, we can't have this wrap up in any other way. We need to make this wrap up in the common narrative. And it just ruins the movie. The movie's just shit for that reason. Like this year, my wife asked me, do you want to watch it? I'm like, no, hell no. Like, it's just because it's such a letdown. Like, you're laughing the whole way through and then you're just like, oh, you gave in. You gave in. And then it even wraps up on them still trying to hide what they're doing from their families, despite giving into the common narrative. So it's like, okay, you're displaying the toxicity, but most people who are going to watch that are going to go, oh yeah, family, right? It's just always so funny. There's a line in there. It's like, you can't spell families without lies. I always thought that was funny.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because they have to, the common narrative is watching the movie, so they're gonna have to fit it. And it's Vince Vaughn is the other one. Yeah, I have seen that. It's been a few years, but yeah, it's wild just how much of that we see all the time. And yeah, I don't know. I question all of those things more and more, and just how strange it is. And like, that's part of the reason why I want to do some shit that's like jarring to people, because like, there's no good reason to judge someone for doing certain things. Like, so it's almost like I just want to see what happens, because there's no good argument for it. It's like, if I change my hair color for some, like, whatever reason, it's like there are so many assumptions that go along with having a different color hair. And it's so interesting to me. And like, the idea that I would, get judged for it is like, it fascinates me. It's funny because I'm at the point where it wouldn't make me insecure. It would just be like fascinating, and it would lead to some conversations that would probably be, beneficial to some people, where it's like, why, like, what part of this do you find uncomfortable, and why, and what judgments are you seeing in this situation, and why? And like, have you ever questioned that? And they start questioning stuff like that, they may start questioning more things. But yeah, it's crazy how much of that narrative has infiltrated our existence.
Yeah, absolutely. What's normal and what's not, right? And how do we judge? And it's like, what would I do? That's basically what the question is. And what would I do? And would everybody agree with me? And if that's the case, you should be doing that, right? Because that's what makes me feel better. Next question. This is a good one. Despite the things you teach resonating with me, I still find myself depressed and struggling to find joy in life. Now, it might be the effects of the pandemic, but how do I stop becoming the victim of a narrative? For example, I'm depressed because of X.
So I think with feelings like that, it's almost what I've found in my life is there's judgment on top of sort of expectations that you have. And there's, when you have sorts of realizations about things, or you start understanding things more, you almost like judge yourself for not feeling great all the time. And so when it comes to feelings of feeling depressed and feeling like you shouldn't feel depressed, or desiring to feel happy, or seeking happiness and feeling like happiness should be a direct byproduct of understanding these things, I think there's a few ways we can go with this question, but I think this is one of them, of having a sort of desire, like the desiring for a positive experience is a negative experience. The acceptance of a negative experience is a positive experience. That sort of paradox, I think, is applicable here. And what I find sometimes is like, I don't always feel great. Like there are times that I get self-judgmental, like I feel anxious, I worry about things, like, and the improvement that I've had in my life is not judging myself on top of those feelings for feeling those things. And so they happen, it's okay, I'm a human, it's, you know, part of our existence is feeling all sorts of things, but there's nothing saying that all of those things that I feel are bad except for my perception. They're just how I am perceiving those things. They are just feelings that I am having. And like the improvement that I mentioned is that I don't judge myself on top of feeling those things. And I think that the judgment of it or the resistance of it can exacerbate those feelings and kind of blow them out of proportion. And then, you know, while you're feeling them, but also leading up to when you're not feeling them, then all of a sudden you're getting anxious about feeling depressed or anxious about feeling anxious or worried about, you know, the next time you start feeling that way. But if you understand that it's always okay to feel whatever you feel, then there's no, you know, additional layers on top of it. And it's just a surface level thing that you are able to observe and see it for what it is, and, you know, maybe dig into it a tiny bit and see, you know, what's sort of causing that, what's feelings of lack do you have, what, you know, identity are you holding on to, what perceptions are you holding on to potentially is that you have given some semblance of truth to, like, have you questioned those beliefs as to what's leading to that in itself. But I think understanding that no matter what you're feeling, it's okay to feel, whether it's, you know, any of the you know, quote unquote negative emotions that we have stigmatized as being things we shouldn't feel. When you feel those, understanding that it's okay to feel them in the moment, you know, having some deal of acceptance or surrender to those feelings, at least that helps me not like blow them out of proportion and then, you know, worry about when I'm going to feel them next and things like that. It kind of cuts through that. So it's just what it is. And I find that those situations and feelings don't last nearly as long as they used to because I'm accepting of them when they do arise.
Yeah, responsibility, right? And that actually, I would say that that might actually help a great deal. In the case of the example, I'm depressed because of X. I would rephrase that in my own mind of I feel depressed because of my reaction to X. And so all of those things implies that it's not what it appears to be at face value, and that it's changeable, which is a very different perspective as opposed to being the victim of X, right? And so this is super important right now with the pandemic, with the continued restrictions on our lives and the way that we live and our freedoms. It's just important to keep in mind that you can let that get to you. You can let that depress you. You can let that anger you. And to some degree, it should do all of those things because this is a really messed up situation that we're in. But on the other hand, that doesn't limit your ability to change how you respond to it or to see new things or new opportunities within this experience, right? Like if you can't go out and see your friends as often, this might be a good opportunity for you to start looking for the value in hanging out by yourself or in reading or taking up a new craft or taking up something new. If you are getting caught up in the narrative of what's happening in the world, especially, and this is something a lot of people have been voicing to me about the pandemic, government, whatever, wherever this is all going one way or another, you can focus on the narrative that you assume is happening, which is often the narrative that you're told is happening by one party or another or many, or you can focus on your part in what's happening now, which is really what you have. That is your power. That is where your potential is the part that you're playing. Right? Because everything you do changes that narrative. I think it's so important to recognize that you're not a victim of the narrative, you are an equal part of it. That the narrative is just an attempt to describe the changes that are always happening, but it's always an inaccurate way of describing that change. It's always an assumption of the change. The change is happening. So what you get to determine is what part of that change are you going to be? what are you doing here and now? Because that changes everything else that's happening. But so long as you're committed to a fictional narrative, it will limit the possibilities that are open to you. It'll limit the opportunities that you see. And so I would say it's important to remember that the narrative isn't truth. Your response to it isn't the only one that's there. And as soon as you can recognize that responsibility and that uncertainty, it will free up some of your potential, and you'll have more options.
Yeah, I've gotten a few questions about just like, what if, mandate lockdowns start happening more and more. And I think for me, it just comes down to, kind of that idea of control what you can control, which you'll find isn't much, but understanding that, there are two ways that you can look at it. There are multiple, more than two ways. There's tons of perspectives you can have on that. And you can, focus on all the things that you can't do because of it, or you can focus on all the things that you can do and the potential openings in your life that you have because you can't do those things that you more habitually do. Like maybe you habitually spend your weekends doing X, Y, or Z, but like that's not an option. So like there's now opportunity to not have an excuse to not do these other things that maybe you've been wanting to do for a while. And so I think just, perspective is important to keep in mind, that there isn't a hard and fast truth. Even though a lot of people are reacting in a certain way to a certain situation, doesn't mean that you have to react in that way. It's okay to react differently than everyone else is. It's okay to not, feel like everything's like going horribly for you, and see, some silver linings. Like it's okay to do that. You're allowed to do that. It is your perspective and your prerogative, and your reaction to the narrative comes down to you and your responsibility, as Ray mentioned. Next question. Is it my turn? All right. I am becoming more present. However, sometimes I don't answer / don't know how to deal with people who I know are being run by their pain body. Any advice? So pain body is, for those listening and haven't heard of it, is essentially something from, I think Eckhart Tolle is the one who coined it, maybe, or he got it from somewhere else. I don't know. He used it in his books, and it's the sort of, I don't know what the best way to explain it. It's kind of like equivalent to a degree to ego. It's like the past conditioning that causes you to almost unconsciously react in certain ways. To relieve your fears in a certain sense, but it's sort of like habitual reaction patterns that are unconscious in a way. Yeah. Do you want to start with that one? All right. So in terms of dealing with people with, reacting to their pain body. So I think first of all, understanding that it has nothing to do with you. Like the way that people act towards you has nothing to do with you, as much as it seems like it. Like if they're directly saying like, fuck you and your name, and like you made me do this, and this specific thing that you did caused me this harm, it's like still doesn't have anything to do with you. Still entirely within themselves, that they're expressing a certain feeling that they're working through, and as mentioned, pain body that they have. And so I think the first thing you got to understand is it has nothing to do with you. And so that in itself can help a lot. It helps me a lot with just dealing with anyone day to day, whether it's labeled as them having a pain body or just like a reaction or, whatever. It's just, that's just another label. It's just any sort of reaction or way that people are acting. So I think realizing that it has nothing to do with you, seeing where they're coming from can help. Being able to have that true empathy of realizing that if you have gone through and had gone through the same things they have, you would do that too. You would have that pain body in whatever way and act towards yourself the exact same way that they are acting towards you. So I think these things are a few things that can immediately help sort of shift a perspective of the situation. Is having realizing it doesn't have to do with you, and being able to show that true empathy, and then just, I guess, not getting too caught up in it and sort of catching yourself too, because I think a lot of times people can get caught up in the sort of spiritual ego side of it, where they see, and I guess if you see yourself in them, it's may not be as much, but if you get caught up in spiritual ego, is like, I have, conquered my pain body, but then you find yourself reacting to someone else's pain body. It's like, have you really conquered anything? Or like, are you in the exact same boat as them? And now you're blaming them for having a pain body and causing you to react in a certain way. So I think understanding those things, and then just realizing that, yeah, like, you're them. There is no you that's higher and mightier and, more enlightened than anyone or anything. And if you're struggling with, reacting or interacting with people like that, it's not like, I'm not saying you have to seek them out and be like, I need to work on these things, so I'm going to go find the, toughest pain body out there, and not be reactive towards them. It's like, you don't have to, and you don't even have to keep them in your life necessarily. There's nothing telling you that either. You can, I think a lot of people will say things with, a toxic person in their life. They're like, oh, cut them out cold turkey. I don't think you have to, get all dramatic like that. But I think, distancing yourself, you don't have to, maybe you don't, reach out to them. You don't, if you have a weekly meal with them, you don't have as many, just sort of slowly separate. And if they start asking why, and pushing you on that, you can be frank with them and say, I don't enjoy my interactions with you, quite frankly. And I'm not going to spend my life, dealing with your shit in whatever way that comes to be. But yeah, so that's a few things that help me keep in mind.
It's pretty much it, right? I mean, you can deal with somebody who's dealing with their pain body by recognizing yours, which gives you empathy, or you can just work on getting past yours, in which case now you're in a state of clarity, right? So either way, that's the best way to interact with them. But if you are getting past your pain body, then chances are you can sit there watching them lash out at you, and you can just watch it happen and then let it pass, and it won't bother you at all. Whereas if you are still looking at your ego, if you are still defending yourself, then this is a perfect opportunity for you to get some practice, as Andrew said. And again, you don't have to go looking for those people. And I'll add, they will find you. They will find you as you start to let go of your triggers, as you start to let go of your narrative. Things will come along to try and bring those back up. And it's not that those things are happening to bring them back up. It's just that the habitual reaction of those things popping up is still there. And so you'll always have the opportunity to face that. We're just going to take a quick moment here, and we'll be back in a second with another question from another Patreon supporter, which I have been really looking forward to getting to for the last week. So we'll talk to you in a minute. Okay, and we're back. So this question is something that I've actually been asked a number of times over the last year, and it's something that I typically avoid, and there's a very specific reason that I avoid it. And so I just wanted to address this quickly. The question is very much, can you give examples of certain situations that you've been in or would go through, and what you would do in those situations using some of the insights that you discuss in your podcast? Now, somebody asked me this in a one-on-one session a little while ago, and I answered it this way because I think it's very important that I explain why I don't do that. I don't ever want people thinking that the way I would deal with things in this incarnation is the way that they should deal with things. There is no right way. That's very much the point, is that all of the insights, all of the lessons, all of these perspectives that we're talking about are meant to be just absorbed and recognized to the best of your ability, and then they will become embodied and expressed in each and every situation that you're in. And so we're recommending things that you just keep in mind to keep your state of clarity. But if you're ever wondering what I would do in the situation that you're in, the answer is very clearly what you're doing. that's exactly what I would do, is what you're doing, because you're me, right? I would do the best I could with what I understood, which is exactly what you're doing. What you do with it from there is irrelevant, because you're the best one to make that call based on how much you see and how much you understand, right? So if you're ever wondering, what would Ray do? Just ask yourself, what am I doing? And there's your answer. And that's very much why I don't give specific instances on what you should do with certain insights, is because what I would do in that situation based on my life story may not be what makes sense for you. It may not be what's best for you to learn the next lesson or to set yourself a little bit more free.
Yeah, that's awesome. It kind of reminds me, kind of similar to one of our earlier episodes where we were talking about the perception of division and separation, when I was still like very much working through that idea that, our awareness is the same. Like my awareness is your awareness. It's not that I am just the awareness of Andrew separate from you being the awareness of Ray. It's the same awareness. And I was like, well, why can I wave my hand right now? Like you can't wave my hand. And you're like, well, I just did. I was like, all right, it'll come around because it's still not quite there. But yeah, because I rewatched some of our first episode came up, and I was rewatching some parts, and I was like, wow, I've kind of come a ways from that first episode, and just like things getting clearer, because I was very much still, yeah, there was a lot that I was, working through, I guess. But
yeah, well, there's a lot to work through. I mean, I've been at this 20 years. I'm still working through it for sure. No, it's always interesting, right? Because we assume that, well, if it's all me, I should have control. Not quite. That's not. Your spleen is also you, but you're not running it deliberately right now, right? So just keep that in mind. Next question is yours.
all right. Uh, all right. Any advice on getting out of a funk / unmotivated state to start working on your goals? Do you want to start this one, or do you want me to?
I think, as with everything, removing some of the weight. Motivation is one of those funny things that we always assume that we need the carrot or a stick, right? We need a carrot to chase or a stick to run from in order to get momentum and get moving. But we don't realize often that our momentum is very much limited by the weight that we're carrying on the journey, right? Like we're carrying what we should do, what other people have said worked for them, and what might happen when we finally get there. And so we're way too invested in the goal and how the goal reflects on our value and everything that's going to go with that to really take the next step with any degree of clarity, right? And that's the point, is that it's very difficult to feel enthusiastic for a journey when there's so much riding on that journey. And so if you can remove some of that weight, if you can look at the journey in terms of it being about the step you're on, because ultimately that's the journey, is the quality of the step that you're on right now, right? Then that pressure will come off, and you will start to feel yourself being more enthusiastic. You will start to feel yourself doing it for the sake of doing it because it feels good to do. And that kind of motivation almost never runs dry because it's self-perpetuating. As somebody asked me, what reasons do you have to be happy? And my response is none. That's why I'm so happy. It's because I don't need one, right? I don't need a reason to be happy, in the same way that I don't need a reason to be motivated. It's just will in action, right? And as long as I'm not doing that action for a particular end result that's going to make me better or make me more fulfilled or make me happier or anything else, there's no weight to that action, right? There's no danger, there's no risk, right? So I'm not just sitting there wondering which way I should go. I'm not just sitting there worried about making the wrong move. I'm just going to move and then roll with whatever happens. And because I can adapt, because I can change the direction I'm going in any way I want to, because I'm not committed to a certain end result. Everything is just growth and expression. And after a while, that is its own motivation. It just takes some practice to get there.
Yeah, I think when people get caught up in having an end goal and a ends to a means mentality, and the doing or the outcome makes up for how shitty the doing was. It's like this idea of sort of like the sunk cost fallacy comes into play. And it's like, you've worked all of these years to, become a doctor or something. You've been in school for 5 years. And it's like, because everything of your doing was focused on this end result instead of like the action in itself of being, and the doing in itself being that sort of fulfillment, it builds up this idea that it was just like, a dead period of your life, just life wasted. And it's like, it doesn't have to be like that. It's kind of like the myth of Sisyphus, that by who Albert Camus, where Sisyphus, he got sentenced to, basically by the Greek gods or some gods, to roll a boulder up a mountain for his entire life. And then as soon as he gets to the top, it just rolls back down. And the book, the myth of Sisyphus, is like that. It's deemed this horrendous punishment. Like, he's doing this thing that is meaningless his entire life. But then Albert Camus says he thinks it's, a myth, and it's actually very similar to living life. And it's the myth is that Sisyphus wasn't happy. Like, what if he was happy the entire time? And what if the mountain was beautiful and he was pushing the boulder up the mountain, and the doing in itself was enough? And it's kind of like how life is. Like, when that is the doing is fulfilling in itself, you don't need a meaning to life to work towards. You don't need end goals to achieve in order to find some semblance of value, because even if you achieve a goal, it's a split second achievement. And then it's like, it's just one tiny split, hairline moment. But yeah. And then I think when it comes to feelings of procrastination or motivation, just the idea of motivation, I think is kind of blown out of proportion a little bit. Like, people wait around for a feeling of motivation. And I think, we talk about this a lot, just how action, like, nothing can replace action at the end of the day. So if you're not feeling motivated, just do something, and eventually some feelings will arise through that. Like, as soon as you start doing things, you'll start, building up some momentum where I don't know about accomplish something, but get some semblance of results from the action that you're taking. And then you'll feel motivated to continue taking action. But like, if you're sitting on the couch eating potato chips, waiting to get motivated to go to the gym, like, it's probably not going to come knocking. Like, how about you set a goal of putting down the potato chips, set a goal of standing up off the couch, and then see where that leads you, instead of sitting there without taking any action, completely foisting the responsibility off onto some external feeling, on God to like rain down on you to like gift you with motivation. How about you just stand up and go put your gym clothes on and see if that will build some momentum, and all of a sudden you're at the gym.
Do something you're not used to doing. Right? Like, that's it. Just break the cycle. It doesn't matter what it is. It really doesn't. I mean, just put yourself in a situation you're not used to dealing with, and you will find energy. You will find that suddenly you have will, and it's happening in the moment, because of course you have to deal with the situation that you're in. And of course that might piss you off, that might make you self-reflect, it might do a number of things, but it's going to cause you to use your energy. It's going to cause you to actually move in a way that you're not familiar with, which is going to give you an insight into the value of movement as a whole. And then you'll just start to feel good about moving in general, because it feels good. And stagnation, as much as it's comfortable, it's also the path to death, right? Like, in stagnation, nothing happens. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. And so, yeah, if you want to be motivated, you have to give yourself reasons to be motivated. And often that's just discomfort. Right? Just get out of your comfort bubble, and you will start to experience momentum.
Do you believe money is crucial for a society to work out? Do you want to start this one off?
No. That would be my answer. No, I don't. I don't think that money is crucial for a society to work. I think that money is crucial for an egotistical society to work. And that really depends on what you mean by work. I wouldn't say that our current society is really working. so much as just continuing to limp on despite the consequences. So I think that for us to achieve a society that does in fact work, or that is in alignment with what's in its own best interest, that we have to get past the egotistical state of mind that drives the monetary system and the entire need for capitalism to begin with. I think we actually have to have some recognition that we are all in fact in this together, that we're all extensions of the earth, or extensions of the same awareness, or extensions. It doesn't even matter how we come to terms with it, but we have to stop perceiving the division to be so real just because it seems real. And then once we do that, then the entire idea of needing to get mine, or trying to profit myself above everybody else, stops making sense. And as soon as that stops making sense, so does money. That would be my answer there. Nice short one.
Yeah. I'm on the same page. I don't think I've spent as much time thinking about, the world without money, or the ideas of money, or history of money and whatnot. But I think it is just an interesting concept, and the whole idea of, people wanting more money and not even more wealth necessarily has always been pretty fascinating with me. It's something that Alan Watts talks about a lot, that idea that just people want more money in their bank account. And it's not even that they want, more wealth, or what that can give them. And, I think the conversation shifts very rapidly when you see yourself as everything. And until then, I think it's tougher to have that sort of conversation in the need, and whether or not it is actually necessary. But yeah, I see myself a lot more just like, especially because in my neighborhood, there's a lot of like homeless people around, and even just like seeing that and seeing them around, like doing more in the past couple months to like help them out when I can, and seeing that, because, although I know I can't, give money to every single homeless person in New York, it's like, it doesn't hurt to help a few out, help myself out here and there when I have the opportunity. But yeah, so I think, same page as Ray. And I think the conversation is a different one, and it can be tougher to have when the illusion of division is still very strong in our society.
Absolutely. And that's definitely something we're working towards, which is why these episodes are so much fun. Okay, so now we'll get into a bit more of the metaphysical stuff, because this is always entertaining to me. The idea of reincarnation, past lives. Now, I don't know if you've had any experience with past life regression or past life regression therapy. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of exploring past lives, but it's something that's documented. People do go through these experiences where they perceive themselves to be in different characters, different lives, different timelines, and then they learn lessons from that, or rather they assume that there are lessons that they're learning in this incarnation that are tying from those past lives. Often that's misinterpreted as what karma is supposed to mean. Do you think do you think there is a such thing as reincarnation? And if not, what do you think is happening there?
So no, not in the sense of like the egotistical, like I was this person, then I was this person, then I was this person, now I'm Andrew. It's like, if I'm everyone, then I was always everyone. So I think when past life regression happens, I've dug into it a little bit. I don't have a ton of experience thinking about it, but and we've sort of had conversations about this a little bit, but understanding that I am everyone and everything, that means that I'm not just everyone, in 2021 on Earth. It's like I'm everyone now, which is eternal. So when someone does sort of past life regression, I think it's just tapping into that deeper awareness of being able to experience a different timeline almost, but at the same time, if it's all now, eternally now, then it's just our perception that it was a past life. It's just another awareness that is here now happening, and we just perceive it. It's kind of the similar aspect of like, the beginning of existence is just, we have a flawed perception of time, thinking that there, had to have been a beginning. And then it's like, well, what's before the beginning? Why couldn't have just always been? Because of our, perception of division and time, and the illusion of time, seeing it as, truth, it skews these things. But yeah, that's my perspective.
That's awesome. That's exactly correct. Now, I've thought about this for a long time, because of course there are instances, and I know from clients that I've worked with, where they went for past life regression, and in doing so managed to look at a particular version of themselves or another incarnation that led them to an insight that helped them get over something that they were dealing with in this incarnation, right? And so, like, for example, one client that I worked with had a history of abuse with every spouse that she had had. She had been married like 3 times. And so she went to do past life regression and tapped into an incarnation of herself, which was an abusive male. And so she got to experience things from that perspective. And because it allowed her to look at things without attaching her character to it, she managed to gain some context. And it changed her reaction to her own experience. It changed her perspective of everything that she had gone through, which I thought was great, really cool. But as you said, there is no past and there is no future, and everything is now. So all she was really doing was allowing herself to see another version of herself that is in the here and now. But often when we do past life regression, we will immediately assume that we are certain characters that we can relate to, that relate to our current perspective of who we are, right? So a lot of people who do past life regression will see their ancestors because they can relate to that. They can see the narrative, how it ties them together, or they'll experience a life of somebody who is from their culture, or from somebody who was in a situation that's similar to the situation they just went through. And there's always a point of relation between the two characters, between who I see myself to be and who I allow myself to access, right? So what's interesting about that is that because it's all now, it means that the more I let go of this character, the more I can relate to all the other characters. And that doesn't just mean human, because if I'm getting rid of the connection, that means I have to relate to something that's similar to me, and I stop seeing myself as something that needs to be compared to. I can relate to DNA, I can relate to trees, I can relate to plant life. And from that, I can get insights, I can add to my context, I can grow. So it's not just true metaphysically, it's also true with people we deal with in the day-to-day life, right? If you were to meet somebody from another country, if you were to hold on to the idea of yourself being an American, it'd be very difficult for you to interact with that person and see their cultural history or see what's important to them. Whereas if you didn't identify, you would immediately have more insights into their way of life. So it's true regardless of if it's in this incarnation or if we're tapping into other incarnations that also exist now. It's always the dissolution of the self that allows us to access all of the other insights within our own singular universal awareness. I've always thought it was really interesting that we almost limit the amount of access we have by calling it past life regression.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. All right. Do you think people would understand you better if they have done mushrooms or psychedelics? I like that question. So we've talked about this in the past, the idea of psychedelics being a tool that can sort of clear some of the fog, but not a end in itself. And I think that kind of plays into this question of like, could people understand some of the things that we talk about if they have done psychedelics? Well, a lot of what we talk about is questioning your perceptions of yourself and understanding that no perception is truth. The description is never the described. The interpretation is never the interpreted. And I think things like mushrooms and psychedelics allow you the opportunity. It kind of like opens the door to be able to maybe get to that understanding more clearly, but it's not going to take you all the way. Exactly. Like it still comes down to you, and insights that you have still are you. Like when you're, high on marijuana or, psychedelics or anything, like it's still you. You're just able to see more clearly, and there's not as much distortion. There's not as much, perception of division. There's not as much self. There's not as much identity or ego involved in everything that you're thinking and experiencing. So you're able to see things a little bit more clearly. So I think that even with things we talked about, like I was just talking about how on episode 1, there were things that I was still very much, not as clear on. And I think, since doing some psychedelics, it has helped me see some things more clearly. There have been very distinct times I remember tripping and being like, oh, that thing Ray said that I had like was not grasping, like that I see it now, like I get it now. So like it does allow you for that opportunity. But if you still have like very strong perceptions of the way things are and concrete beliefs about the way things are, it will peel those back for sure. But if you're not willing to, like look inside, the door may be open, but if you don't want to look inside, it's not gonna, it comes down to you at the end of the day, and it's not gonna, do any of the work for you, but it can certainly be a very helpful tool in that sense.
Absolutely. And I just want to say on an additional note that it's super important to not try psychedelics with the intention of becoming enlightened, right? Or understanding us, because immediately you're projecting an idea, right? It's like having a psychedelic experience, waiting for a certain feeling, right? And this happens to so many people. It's like, I'm not feeling it yet. It's like, because you're projecting what you think you should be experiencing, right? Which is changing the entire experience for you. It's limiting it in every way. And so the same is true, is that if you are going to try psychedelics, or if you are going to trip out, as it were, just keep in mind that the point is to not have a point. It's to just be where you are, right? And just to just be in that experience. And as you allow that to happen, all of a sudden, everything that Andrew and I have been talking about will start to fall together. But if you go into it going, I'm going to eat these and I'm going to think about what Andrew and Ray have been talking about, you are going to have a very frustrating trip, because you're still thinking about concepts. You're not allowing yourself to sink into the reality, which is ultimately what we're trying to describe. We're just using concepts to describe the reality, right? And so in order to experience that, you have to allow yourself to surrender the concept. Then you can use the concepts as a tool rather than having them be a master, just like your mind, right? So that's a great question.
Yeah, like the pointers to the truth are never the truth. So literally nothing that we say ever is the truth. It's just pointers to it. So if you have, ears to hear, then it can make sense, but it still comes from within your awareness, your experience, that the concepts become, clearer, which, we can do our best to drop seeds and explain things, but we still don't even come close to doing any of it justice. So it's like, if you're relying on us, like Ray said, you're gonna have a frustrating trip. And I will say, the one time that I did have expectations going into a trip, taking a higher dose than I had previously, thinking it was going to be, the same thing, but just like going deeper into it. It was it wasn't a bad trip or anything, but it was very sobering, as Ray's put it. And so that was the one time. And since then I go into it and I'm just, I'm here now. I am awareness experiencing itself. And that's all I know is what is here and now, and see what happens. And that's pretty much it. I go into it, kind of understanding that it's uncertain and I have no idea what is going to happen, and that's okay, being comfortable in that. But the one time I did a higher dose and I had expectations going into it, it was very much sobering and not what I expected. And because I had expectations of it, it wasn't close to anything that I expected. And I came out of it kind of like, not bummed out, but just like understanding that, that's what happens when you have expectations going into it, basically.
Absolutely right. Everything gets measured according to your expectations, and it takes away the flavor, right? It's just like anything else. If you build it up in your head, that's what you're experiencing rather than what's actually happening, right? So yeah, that's funny. Okay, this is my last question, and I figured I'm going to wrap up on this one. Then you have, I'm sure, another question, but I want to ask you this because we were talking about reincarnation, past lives, the fact that all awareness is singular and exists only in the here and now. What do you think that means about lost loved ones? Do you think we see them again?
I mean, did they ever exist in the first place? And the idea of, lost loved ones, I mean, like, who was the loved one that wasn't you? Like, that is it not just a story that's been created, that the story is born and then the story ends, but it was never anything real to begin with, and it was always sort of in the realm of that illusion of duality.
Yes.
So
now that's difficult though, because what we are talking about there is solitude in the extreme, right? Which isn't necessarily what reality is. I mean, in reality, we have the dualistic experience. Like, we always are born to parents, right? We always have some degree of community or family or familial connection, whatever that might be. So when we lose somebody, like, for example, if a parent passes on or a child passes on or something like that, we like to tell ourselves that, we'll see them in the afterlife, right? And to some degree, you can see the reality that that's based on, right? Which is that you're always going to see the same awareness. You're always going to continue seeing, because the people that we love aren't the people that we love, are they? Right? The expression that they are isn't the person that they are. They're the awareness that's expressing itself through that person, right? So when we love somebody, we love who they truly are, regardless of their expression, regardless of their distortion, regardless of the character they've convinced themselves that they are, right? So as you said, we're ultimately just loving ourselves. But if that's the case, then everyone is a version of our loved ones as well. They're a version of us, right? So when a client asked me this recently, what happens to our loved ones? Do we see them again? My answer was, I'm talking to one right now. Right? Because we're always surrounded by those who are closest to us, because they're all us in infinite variations. In every life, there's a partner. In every life, there's a child. In every life, there's a family. And well, not every life, but most lives within the dualistic spectrum have that situation, or rather that dynamic. And so you're seeing infinite variations of not just a single person or a single awareness, but the relationships that single awareness would have with other versions of itself, right? And so it's kind of like that video that you sent me the other day, and my wife had sent it to me as well, about there being this small tribe of super enlightened beings on another planet who then went and decided they were going to come to Earth and save everybody, right? And they were because they were super enlightened, and they were going to decide to come here, and they're going to go through a big hard journey and so on and so forth. There's such an ounce of truth to that. And on the same token, there's so much distortion there, because now there's the narrative of this tribe of super enlightened beings coming to Earth and saving us, and there's an idea of humanity and all of that. But what they're really describing is the fact that there is a core group of variations, right, to awareness. There is the core of there's a me and a you, right? And there's always a me and a you in this dualistic experience. And so we're always talking to our loved ones. They just take different forms, right? Like, I've talked to a version of you that was 70 years old and had lived through the hippie movement. And the differences between you and that person is just the lives you've lived and the way that you perceived yourself, right? But I can clearly see the same awareness between the two of you, right? So you are in fact, the same awareness. It's just that he was never the person that he identified with, and neither are you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question that I thought of while you were saying that. With the idea that, like, we are impacting our environment and our environment impacting us, people have the idea of, the identities of people, like, taking that as truth, but it never is. And we impact our environment impacts us. That means all of our loved ones are within our environment and we are within their environment. So they are still alive in the sense that they are us. Like they, like my grandpa who passed away when I was younger, like I was pretty close to him and he impacted my life. Like he is still in existence, not, the ego identity of him, but his awareness expressed through James Sweeney is still within, because he impacted my entire family and all of his friends and everything. So through that, they are still very much there. But I am curious, just along these lines with people who pass away, and people will say, that someone passed and then they felt a hug or something like that, or some like supernatural thing happen, and it's like, oh, that's them, in heaven telling me that, they're okay, blah blah blah. Like, what do you think that is when someone feels something like a hug or a kiss on their cheek, or something? Is it that they are kind of superimposing a wish that it happened, and then some feeling hits them in a way, even if it's just like, the wind in a certain way, and they perceive it as that and they kind of attach to it? or
That's a
or do
really
you
good
think
question.
there is something actually to that?
That's a really good question. It really comes back down to what you were saying about the ripples that our loved ones make, right? Like they affect us, they change us. And in that way, we're not, human beings aren't very different from thoughts within a singular mind, right? One thought affects another thought, and that creates new thoughts, just like one person affects another person and creates children, right? And those children evolve to basically grow beyond the thoughts that were their parents, right? But as for the experience of like a kiss on the cheek or a hug, in my experience, it's because of the ripple. It's because of the influence that person had on us. There's a part of our awareness that is almost acting out what they would do in order for us to kind of bridge that gap, right? Because they are us. There's no separation. So I'm not in any way downplaying the fact that, it's that person expressing love, but it's not that person expressing love. It's the awareness of that person, which is you, right? And so, yeah, I think that, as with everything, there's an ounce of truth to it. And I think that there's a certain amount of wishful thinking that can go into that. I mean, George Carlin does a great skit on the absurdity of people who are like, I'm sure he's all staring down at us right now. And then he kind of makes a big joke about this, like, really, you think that's what he's doing with, nothing else to do with his life? He's just watching you. Like, I'm sure he's got better things to do. So it's kind of funny. And I definitely encourage you to watch that skit. But there's so much more happening than we're aware of. And as long as we have this perspective that we're bodies, for one, two, ideas, or separate, right, it becomes very difficult to interact with the rest of our consciousness, with the rest of our awareness, in a way that is as meaningful as it could be, which is the same as very much dreaming. When you are in a dream and you have an experience in that dream, that experience is very meaningful to you. It'll shake you for the rest of the day, and it will change you as a person, right? And it's largely, it has that deeper impact because you recognize it's your dream, right? It's you doing it as opposed to it being done to you. And so if we can get to the point where we actually recognize this is one big dream of a limitless mind, then we can actually start getting more meaningful and symbolic lessons out of it, such as, the communication of one of our awareness that has passed but still dwells on within us. There's so much there, right? And so, yeah, there's a whole other way of living that religion and spirituality tries to describe, and it tries to practice, and it creates a narrative, and it creates these ceremonies and everything else to try and communicate what could be a beautiful experience, but we miss it in the interpretation. We miss it in the translation between, the insight going through the ego and then it becoming another part of the play, right? But yeah, I think that there is some truth to all of that. And on the other hand, I think that there's a great amount of illusion that's still based on our perception of ourselves as separate, for sure.
I was also curious, going back to the story that I sent you and your wife sent you of the intergalactic beings, that, the people who created that story feel like they probably think they are those things, for sure, which is, yeah, I watched that and I was like, I know Ray's gonna enjoy this one. But I'm curious what the ounce of truth you see in that is? Like, what part of that has that sort of ounce of truth in it?
Absolutely. Comes back down to the unity and duality thing, right? Like, unity is ultimately what is. And in unity, you have complete solitude. There's not even another person to talk about or think about or conceptualize. There's no me in unity, because me requires a you, right? But as soon as we get past unity, as soon as we experience duality, or rather the beginning of duality, now you have one goes to two, right? And then two goes to three, and so on and so forth, right? And so the duality expands, the variations expand. Well, what they're talking about in that video is the variations off of that first point of me, that very small tribe of super enlightened beings, right? Were the first excerpts of duality, still keeping in mind that their unity expressed as duality, and without getting lost in all of the dualistic mumbo jumbo of thinking that they actually are separate. That's the ounce of truth, that we can actually get to that point. And I've often thought about our history as a species, because the closer we get to the recognition that we are one singular awareness, that we are God, the less we invest in the physicality, or in the physical story. And so if you look at our population, which we mentioned earlier is over 7 billion people, right? Often people have children because they want to continue their legacy, or they think this is what they should do, and so on and so forth. Well, none of that makes sense when you recognize that you are the infinite universe, or the awareness of the universe. None of that makes sense at all. And so all of a sudden you wouldn't have as many children, you wouldn't have as many fears, you wouldn't have this need to continue your legacy, you wouldn't in any way have the same physical soap opera that we're having right now. And so the closer we get to awareness, the more our population drops, right? And so that's kind of the point of that video as well, is that the closer we get to evolving as a species, or as awareness, the less we're going to get involved with things that continue to distort the outcome, that continue to cause more consequences. We'll have more awareness of the ripples that we're creating, and thus we'll make different choices. And so as much as it's true at the beginning that there's a small population of us that expand into a bigger one, it's also true at the end, where that larger population has to reduce itself back to a smaller population again to find balance. Until we do, we're in some serious shit. I mean, there's only so much food on the planet. There's only so many resources on this earth. There's only so much to go around. And as long as we avoid alignment with that, or the recognition that we're a part of that, we're going to continue to push ourselves into this point of desperation and scarcity as a result. So I think that would be the answer to truth, is that the closer we get to awareness, or as they call it, enlightenment, the closer we get to that small core group of people who recognize they're all one another. But they're not coming to Earth.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, that was such an interesting video. And the someone DM'd it to me, and they were like, "I absolutely loved this video. I think you would love it." And I sent them a decently long response, just like, yeah, it's an interesting story, is kind of how I started out. But yeah, that idea, and I'm curious to see, I guess we'll see, but with going back from population expanding to decreasing, if I guess it'll be probably a combination of a multitude of factors, but if it's natural disasters, asteroids, or it's a more prolonged just understanding of getting closer and closer to awareness and the recognition of unity. But it'll probably be a combination, I'm sure.
It's going to happen one way or another. The longer we put it off, the harder it's going to be. I mean, the simple fact is, like honeybees are vanishing, man. I mean, what Einstein, I think, said it, honeybees disappear. We got 4 years left on this planet, right? Like, you got to consider all of that keystone species. This all makes a difference. I mean, as long as we're putting it off, we're going to continue to exacerbate the consequences, as long as we're not practicing awareness about what we do and why we do it and where we're going, right? As a result of what we do and why we do it, we're just going to keep putting it off. We're going to keep throwing those snowballs back up the hill, trying to ignore the impending avalanche, right? But then that avalanche will happen, and will, one way or another, our population on this planet is going to decrease one way or another. If it's willingly, it's going to be a lot easier than if it's not. I'm out of questions. Do you have any more?
I do. I have couple on Instagram, back on the Instagram video. Yeah, I have 3 comments here.
Perfect. Let's wrap them up. We promised everybody we'd get to their questions, and we're doing it.
Yes. Yeah. No, this is actually come by quick. I'm so just like relaxed, enjoying this conversation. It makes it easier too, just like having the questions that it's just I feel like we could do this for like 8 hours.
Telethon's
One
coming.
day. Yeah, one day. Um, who or what's keeping you alive? So I think that's kind of similar to something we touched on before with like motivation, or what's your why, kind of like why continue existing. And my response always comes back to like, why not? Yeah. And I was talking to my friend yesterday. We had, yeah, I think our conversation about all this stuff just bounced around for probably 3 hours, probably close to this. And it was great. But he because he has always been, more on the atheist side of things, like very scientific, like he wants to see the logic and the reasoning behind something. So that's why he never got caught up really in religion. Grew up Jewish, but he found that to be silly from an early age. And but he was asking about that, like when it comes to why. And for a while he didn't have like great reason. He thinks about that all the time, like why don't I just stay in bed all day and like do nothing? Like why not? And my response to stuff like that is always like, that's still a choice. Like you're still choosing, like even though you've deemed it as inaction, like sitting on the couch all day, it's still a choice. Like you can't escape making a choice in every single situation. You're always making a choice in one way or another. So, why exist? Why continue existing? Why not? I'm here. Might as well do something about it. I know there are things that I enjoy doing. There's stuff I'm enthusiastic about, whether it's, in part because of my conditioning or just things I like, not taking things too seriously helps, keeping things light, as we've talked about before, not getting too tied to narratives or belief systems. All these things help in the recognition that, we just are and things just are. And that's not to say I have even recently gotten caught on like the pessimistic side of nihilism, and it's like nothing matters. So like, why do anything? And it's like, it just always comes back to why not? I don't really have a great reason why not to. I'm here. I'm here now. That's all I know. Might as well do something with it. That's kind of it for me.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I come from the slightly more dark and depressing side of things, where I was pretty committed to killing myself for a very long time, and so I thought about that in great detail for a very long time. And what stopped it for me was the recognition that it wouldn't do anything. That's the problem, right? Like I could die. I'm not going to die, right? My awareness is going to continue on in all the other incarnations. And so the why is irrelevant. I will always exist. I will always exist. And so it really just comes down to, what do I want to do with it? And you don't have to do anything. You can lay in bed all day, by all means, but try and keep something in mind. The energy you get out of your experience is going to be directly relational to the energy you put into your experience. Right? So if you're complaining about your existence, it's entirely possible you're not looking at who's responsible for that existence. Right? And that's pretty much it. Right? But as for the what keeps me going, I am existence. I'm what's going. There's nowhere to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I found a few more questions on another page. I'm just going to ask you one now.
All right.
Okay. What do I do with all of this information? Does it happen automatically?
So what do I do with all this information? Does what happen automatically?
Insights. The insights that we're talking about, the transition from living egotistically and within the limits of your narrative to feeling freedom, to expressing yourself and embodying your awareness without the limitations of who you think you are and all the conflict that goes with that. We talk about all of this a lot. Most of my content's about it. But again, there's there's the conceptual part. You can take notes, right? But then there's the actual application, the recognition of what we're talking about, the reality below the concepts. And so I think the question here is, now that we've talked about all this, now that I have all my notes, am I changing automatically? Is this going to happen on its own now that I have all of this information, right? Is this just something that I have to wait for it to play out? And that's a really good question. There's a lot in that question. I'm curious to see what you think.
Yeah, well, it's playing out right now, right? And I think it happens when you stop holding on to all of the ideas of the way you think it should be. And it happens when you stop trying to make it happen. You know, when you're silent, it speaks. When you speak, it's silent. So it's basically like when you stop trying to achieve anything and you are just aware here and now of what is, without any of the distortion, without any of the perceptions of division, without all of the belief systems, without all of that, those things that take you, that, you know, fog up that sort of clarity, or, you know, the layers that are on top of, you know, what is here and now, all of your perceptions, all of your judgments about what is. So I think just when it comes to action, it's like, you know, I guess questioning anything when it comes up consistently all the time. I find myself doing that like hundreds of times a day when things come up about, you know, the way I think things to be, the way I think someone else is, the way I think myself is, who I think myself is, who I think someone else is. As soon as it starts happening, I immediately question it. So I get questions like, you know, if you would consider, like, what religion are you closest to? Do you think you'll ever be religious ever again? And I'm like, I don't know if it would be possible. The amount of times I question things every single day, like so many times a day, like there's just no way a religion could fit into that amount of questioning, because it wouldn't make it through.
Wouldn't survive the day. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, it wouldn't survive the gauntlet of my day of questioning. Like, there's no way. So, yeah, when it comes to application, realizing there's nothing you have to apply. Like, when we have these conversations, like, we have this podcast because we enjoy having this podcast. We don't have, you know, a like reason necessarily for each episode. It's the doing for the sake of doing, having the conversation for the sake of having the conversation, going on a walk for the sake of going on a walk, like, you know, doing anything just for the sake of doing it. So there's no, I think as soon as you start getting caught up in thinking there is a right way to apply these things, or a correct way to implement things into your life, or a correct way to understand any of the insights, as soon as you get tied to that, is you're distancing yourself further from it. So it's not trying to do anything at all at the end of the day.
Beautifully said. That was perfect, because that's very much it. It's just allow it to happen. It's already happening. It's so counterintuitive to everything that we've been taught. But I love the fact that the questioner is actually asking, do I just let this happen? Right? Which is an insight in itself. So that's very inspiring. That was a great answer. I really enjoyed that. That's it. I'm officially out of questions now, except for what questions do I ask myself, which you just answered, as many as I can.
All the time. It's like, yeah, the more I can question things, it's just like not letting them slide almost. It's like not allowing myself to settle on answers, which, like, some people would probably say that's got to be exhausting, but I think it's the opposite. I think it's, you know, energizing. And it's not like this obsessive thing. Also, it's not like this discipline or practice that I feel like I need to be doing. And if I don't, you know, question things, then I judge myself and I feel like a failure or whatever. It's just like existing here now, aware of what is, without the additional distortion. And it's not about adding things. And I talk about this when I explain, mushrooms to people, because I get a lot of questions about them with people in my closer in my life and whatnot, friends and family. And I try to explain that it's not like you're adding something. You're not adding layers to it that's making you feel, a level of highness like other drugs. It's like you're just getting peeled back. So, you exist in this state of distortion and very much a fogged perception of the way things are based on all of your conditioning and experiences and whatnot. All that the mushrooms do are help peel those back. So you're able to see things more clearly and appreciate things for what they are, which is why people think that it'll be very helpful for, the mental health community. But yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much like we discussed in our manifestation workshop about the more strings you're attaching to your kite, the less it's going to fly. Right. And that's very much the case, is that, take the weight off, and you'll be amazed at what you're capable of, right? But as long as you're trying to add weight to find out what you're capable of, you're actually just working against yourself, right? And so it's very much, it's like one of those finger puzzles, right? The more you pull, the harder it gets. You're going to push in and do the counterintuitive thing to actually defeat the puzzle, and it's very much the same with our mind.
Yeah, certainly. All right, I got two more questions here. Do you believe the idea that perception is reality? I feel like we've talked about this quite a bit. Yeah, so like I've had people comment like, what if perception is the only thing that is real, or your perception of me is real, or like the way you perceive things is reality? And it's like, no, I mean, it's not. It's your individual perception. Like if two people can perceive the same thing in two different ways, I think that's enough proof in itself that it's not reality. And
give me 2 seconds, I'll perceive it in more than one way.
Yeah, exactly. One person can perceive it in essentially an infinite number of ways. So how could that be reality if there are an infinite number of ways to perceive something?
Absolutely. Though it does influence our experience of what is. That I will admit. But I think that's the danger, is that we assume that because it influences our experience, that it is the definition of what's real, right? But it's just the experience, right? And while that is the experience of reality, it's not reality itself, right? Because if that were the case, then I would never be able to change my experience, right? And I can. I have complete freedom to do that. As we just said, I can find numerous different perspectives of what's happening right now, right? And each of those perspectives is going to change my experience. But that's the point, is that none of those perspectives are actually what's happening right now. It's just changing my experience of what's happening right now. So no, perception is not reality, though perception does in fact influence our experience of reality. That would be my best answer.
Yeah, I think that it's nail on the head. All right. Last question. How does someone deal with constant rejection from people? You want to start this one off?
Sure. I'll start this one off. The simple answer, in my opinion, is stop needing people to accept you, right? And that would be ultimately it, is that if you are worried about people's rejection of you, it's because you're overcommitted to their acceptance of you. There's a part of you that you're looking to validate, that you're looking to add value to through other people's perspectives. And so if you can get past that, or at least you can recognize that you're doing that, then you'll recognize that your value has never been lowered or diminished whatsoever by people's rejection of you. They're just determining the experience that they're going to have. It just doesn't include you. But on the bright side, it's entirely possible that you're better off for that. I had somebody write to me recently and say, I never had any parents. I really grew up identifying with that as not having value and not being lovable. And I pointed out, I'm like, well, you have to understand that, because his parents had left him, that it takes a certain type of person in a certain type of mentality and in a certain emotional state to leave behind a child. Right? So consider the kind of person who left you behind. And then remember that you dodged a bullet. It may not always feel that way, right? But the fact is that you're probably better off for not being raised by people who are in that mentality. And that's not always easy to see when you're identifying with what you think it means about you. But as soon as you can start to question them and their intentions and your perspectives of everything else, then it can start to fall together for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I've never thought of that sort of perspective in that sense, but it makes a lot of sense, certainly. I think it comes down to understanding that there is nothing lacking within you that you need someone to fill that void with. Like, you are perfectly whole and complete exactly as you are right now. Even though it may not feel like that, it doesn't mean that it isn't. And that's just the feeling that you have attached to as the truth based on, your beliefs about yourself and the way things are and who you are and who other people think you are, and all of those things. So I think, it comes.
I can't express that enough. Habit is a huge one. Our brain is desperately trying to form cycles of familiarity. So if you are dealing with thoughts over and over and over again, often what you're dealing with is just your brain's mechanism of trying to form habits. That's it. So it's not something wrong with you, just so much as something you have to spend time deprogramming, right? That's all it is if you're still dealing with it, it's entirely possible that you're not, in fact, still dealing with it. You're just trying to shake off the habit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, our brains are habit forming machines, or they want to be. And I think it comes back to, similar to other responses, just questioning all of it all the time, like why you feel this sense of lack, and then digging into that a little bit, like why you feel like you need to be accepted in the first place, as Ray was saying, and digging into that a bit. And then, when it comes to getting friends and being rejected or accepted or whatnot, a lot of times people try and shift who they are to fit into a certain group of people. And it's like, I don't ever see a logical, rational, good reason to do that, because either, you're a different, version, you're always yourself. But if you're trying to be a certain version of yourself that isn't naturally who you are to fit into this group, then either, there's going to come a point where you can't keep up the mask anymore and you break, and, that can lead to some semblance of anxiety and depression, or you attract, or at the same time, you attract people that you don't actually like. You have this idea of just like being accepted for the sake of being accepted, because you don't want other groups to perceive you as being, like a loner or something. But that's just their perception also, or just your perception of yourself, of feeling bad because for some reason it's like, if you don't have a lot of friends, people see that as negative, which I don't know why. Why is that? Also question that. Like, I think it's probably because historically we've grown up in clans and we kind of need a group of people in order to survive. That's why people get very anxious about how other people perceive them and what other people's opinions about their life is, because it's in our DNA. It's in our evolution to need to be wanted by people. It's not relevant anymore. So you can question that perception. Like, you can fully exist on your own basically nowadays. So just question those things, understand that you're whole and complete exactly as you are right now. You don't need to be accepted by anyone. And if you're, trying to be someone that you're not, and then you get rejected, it's like, you're probably better off being who you are naturally to begin with, because that's going to kind of suck if you're trying to be someone else and then you get rejected. So you might as well just be who you are, because at the end of the day, people are more attracted to authenticity typically anyway. They can feel when you're trying to be someone else to get accepted by them, because at that point you're expecting something out of them if you're trying to act a certain way in order to get accepted. So by not expecting anything out of anyone, you're just being yourself. More people will probably be more comfortable around you, and all of a sudden you may not be getting rejected as much.
That's actually kind of the nice thing about being yourself, is that it's an automatic way of weeding out the shitty company, right? That's pretty much it, right? Because anybody who tells you need people around you are telling you what they feel they need, right? That's all they're telling you. And so keep that in mind. If that person's telling you need people around you, wonder why they're hanging out with you. And there might be an indication of what's going on there. This has been a great episode. I've really enjoyed all of these questions. We did cover as many, well, we covered everything that we've written down, but if we did miss any questions whatsoever, because we have a lot of different channels where we're taking these questions from, I do encourage you to join us on Patreon. Patreon supporters can message us directly, submit their questions on a post that we do before each and every Q&A episode. And so it's much easier to organize, and it'll make sure that you're not forgotten. Likewise, if you'd like to participate in this community that we're growing and are a part of, definitely join us on the Dualistic Unity Community Discord. Great group of people there. We're having a lot of fun in that conversation, and it's going to grow into something epic. So we'd love to see you there.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, this has been a ton of fun. I always enjoy doing Q&A episodes. They're like, easy, just read through them, and, especially being able to have a discussion about it. So I'm looking forward to doing more, and just, more live events coming up, season 2 of everything coming up very soon. And yeah, so if you made it this far in the episode, really appreciate it. Yeah, it means a lot that you
Go
stuck
hydrate.
around. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. And yeah, I certainly did.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you, everybody. We've been working up to this all through season 1. We've mentioned the Q&A episode numerous times, and so we're glad that we finally managed to get to it. Season 2 is starting in January. Do join us on Patreon. And aside from that, we will see you for the last episode of this season next week.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.